Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most famous figures, a man whose name literally became synonymous with leadership and power. I'm talking about Julius Caesar. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab some water or tea, and settle in. We're going to spend the next few hours exploring the life of a guy who somehow managed to be both beloved and despised, brilliant and reckless, a champion of the people, and also maybe kind of a dictator. It's complicated. History usually is. Now, before we get into the drama, the betrayals, and that whole thing with the knives on the Ides of March, we need to start at the beginning. Because Julius Caesar wasn't born powerful. He wasn't born with legions at his command or senators trembling at his name. He was born into a family that was technically aristocratic, but also kind of broke and politically irrelevant, which is a rough combination in ancient Rome, where your family name meant everything and your bank account meant even more. Gaius Julius Caesar was born on July 12th or 13th in the year 100 BC. Some sources say it might have been 102 BC because ancient record keeping was about as reliable as a sundial on a cloudy day. But most historians settle on 100 BC, so we'll go with that. He was born into the Julian family, which claimed descent from the goddess Venus and the Trojan hero Aeneas. Very impressive lineage on paper. The problem was that nobody really cared about your divine ancestry if you didn't have political clout or money, and the Julii were running short on both. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar because Romans loved recycling names, was a moderate political figure. Not terrible, not spectacular. He held some offices, served as praetor, governed a province, and then died suddenly when young Julius was about 16. Just dropped dead. No dramatic assassination, no heroic battle. Just one day he was there, and the next day he wasn't. Very anticlimactic for a family that claimed to be descended from gods. Caesar's mother was Aurelia, and by all accounts, she was actually pretty capable and intelligent. She came from the Aureliae family, which was more politically connected than the Julii at that point. Aurelia took an active role in her son's education and upbringing, which was somewhat unusual for Roman matrons of the time. Most aristocratic mothers handed their kids off to tutors and wet nurses and called it a day. But Aurelia apparently gave a damn, and that probably shaped Caesar more than we realize. Growing up in Rome during this period meant growing up in chaos. The late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC were a mess of political violence, class warfare, and general instability. The Republic was straining under the weight of its own success. Rome had conquered huge territories, and all that wealth and power was pouring back into the city, but it wasn't being distributed evenly. Shocking, I know. The rich were getting obscenely wealthy, the poor were getting poorer, and the middle class was being squeezed out of existence. Two major factions were tearing the Republic apart, the Optimates and the Populars. The Optimates were basically the conservative aristocrats who wanted to preserve the power of the Senate and keep everything traditional and hierarchical. The Populars were the reformers who appealed to the common people and pushed for changes that would redistribute power and wealth. Neither side was particularly noble or pure in their intentions. Both were mostly interested in gaining power for themselves. They just had different marketing strategies. Caesar's family aligned with the populars, which makes sense given their lack of serious political muscle. When you're not part of the elite inner circle, you appeal to the masses. It's Politics 101. One of Caesar's aunts, Julia, was married to Gaius Marius, who was basically the champion of the populars at the time. Marius was a military genius and a political radical who reformed the Roman army and fought his way to 7 consulships, which was absolutely unheard of. He was also married into Caesar's family, which meant young Julius grew up with a very specific political worldview. When Caesar was about 15 or 16, he got engaged to a girl named Casusha. We don't know much about her, except that she was wealthy, and the marriage would have been financially advantageous for his family. But Caesar broke off the engagement pretty quickly, and instead married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Cinna was a major figure in the populars faction and a close ally of Marius. So this marriage was less about love and more about political alliance. Welcome to aristocratic Rome, where your wedding is basically a treaty negotiation. Caesar and Cornelia actually seem to have been genuinely fond of each other, which is nice. They had a daughter together named Julia, and by all accounts, the marriage was solid, which makes what happened next even more stressful. In 82 BC, when Caesar was about 18, the political situation in Rome went from bad to apocalyptic. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the champion of the Optimates and Marius's bitter enemy, marched on Rome with his army and seized control. This was the second time he'd done this, because apparently once wasn't enough. Sulla proceeded to have himself declared dictator and launched a series of proscriptions, which is a fancy Roman word for state-sponsored murder lists. If your name was on Sulla's list, you were fair game. Anyone could kill you and claim your property as a reward. It was like a combination of a purge and a treasure hunt, and it was absolutely horrifying. Thousands of people died. The streets of Rome ran with blood. Sulla was systematically eliminating anyone associated with the populars faction, and that included Caesar's family and friends. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. This wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the threat of death. See, Cornelia's father Cinna had been one of Sulla's enemies, and Sulla wanted to sever all those political connections. Most people in Caesar's position would have divorced their wife immediately, because staying alive tends to be a priority. But Caesar refused. This is one of those moments that tells you something important about someone's character. Caesar was 18 years old, essentially broke, politically connected to the losing side, and staring down the most powerful man in Rome. And he said no. He refused to divorce Cornelia, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on how you want to look at it. Sulla was not amused. Caesar had to flee Rome and go into hiding. He spent months moving from place to place, sleeping in different houses, constantly on the run. At one point, he was captured by Sulla's soldiers and only escaped by bribing them. His mother Orlia and his relatives had to petition Sulla repeatedly for clemency. Finally, Sulla gave in and pardoned Caesar, but supposedly he said something along the lines of, "Fine, have your way." But mark my words, in this young man there are many Mariuses, which is a pretty ominous way of saying, this kid is going to be a problem. Sulla was right, of course, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. After his pardon, Caesar decided that staying in Rome was probably not the healthiest choice. So he did what a lot of young Roman aristocrats did when things got too hot at home. He joined the military and headed east to serve in the provinces. This was a smart move. It got him out of Sulla's sight. It gave him a chance to build a military reputation, and it kept him from being involved in any further political drama while Sulla was in power. Caesar served in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, under the command of Marcus Minucius Thermus. In 80 BC, during the siege of Mytilene, Caesar apparently distinguished himself in combat. He was awarded the civic crown, which was one of Rome's highest military honors. You got the civic crown for saving the life of a fellow Roman citizen in battle. So at age 20, Caesar was already proving that he wasn't just a politically connected aristocrat. He could actually fight. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean we need to talk about one of the most persistent rumors that followed Caesar throughout his entire life. During his time in the East, Caesar spent some time at the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. He was there on a diplomatic mission to secure ships for the siege of Mytilene. And according to his enemies, Caesar became rather close with the king. Very close, inappropriately close. The rumors were that Caesar had an affair with Nicomedes. This was scandalous in Roman society, not because it was a same-sex relationship, but because of the perceived roles. Romans didn't really care if you had relations with men. What they cared about was whether you were active or passive, dominant or submissive. Being the passive partner was seen as shameful and unmanly, especially for someone of the aristocratic class. And the rumors claimed that Caesar had been the passive partner with Nicomedes. These rumors dogged Caesar for his entire life. His political enemies called him the Queen of Bithynia. During his triumphs later in life, his own soldiers sang crude songs about him and Nicomedes. Was any of it true? We have absolutely no idea. It might have been a genuine affair. It might have been vicious political slander. It might have been something in between. Ancient sources are contradictory and biased. What we do know is that Caesar vehemently denied the rumors, and they bothered him enough that he kept denying them, which might have actually made things worse. The whole situation is a good reminder that even in ancient Rome, sexual rumors were a favorite political weapon, and people's private lives were considered fair game for public mockery and character assassination. Caesar continued his military service for a few more years, moving around the eastern Mediterranean. In 78 BC, Sulla died. Finally, the dictator who had terrorized Rome for years just died of natural causes, probably some kind of horrible disease based on the descriptions. With Sulla dead, it was safe for Caesar to return to Rome. So he did. Back in the city, Caesar had to figure out what to do with his life. He was in his early 20s, had some military honors, but no money and limited political prospects. What he did have was ambition and an excellent education. So he decided to become a lawyer, or more specifically, a prosecutor. In Rome, prosecuting prominent figures in the courts was a way for young men to make a name for themselves. It was risky because you were attacking powerful people, but if you won, you gained fame and credibility. In 77 BC, Caesar prosecuted Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella, a former consul who had governed Macedonia and was accused of extortion and corruption. This was a bold move. Dolabella was well connected and defended by some of the best orators in Rome. Caesar lost the case. Dolabella was acquitted, but Caesar's prosecution was apparently impressive enough that people noticed. He had charisma. He could speak well. He was someone to watch. He took on another case the following year, prosecuting Gaius Antonius Hybrida for atrocities committed in Greece. Again, he lost. But again, he made an impression. Losing didn't matter as much as you'd think. What mattered was that people were talking about him. Around this time, Caesar decided he needed better training in rhetoric and oratory. So he did what ambitious Romans did. He went to Rhodes to study with Apollonius Maulon, one of the most famous teachers of the time. Cicero had studied with him too. This was like going to Harvard, but for learning how to argue persuasively and demolish your opponents with words. On the way to Rhodes, Caesar had one of the most bizarre and revealing experiences of his early life. His ship was captured by pirates. Piracy was a huge problem in the Mediterranean during this period. The Roman Republic had neglected its navy, and pirates basically controlled large swaths of the sea. They raided coastal towns, captured ships, and held people for ransom. It was a whole industry. When the pirates captured Caesar and his companions, they demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar was insulted. He told them he was worth at least 50 talents, because of course he did. Even as a captive, Caesar had to assert his superiority. So the pirates increased the ransom demand to 50 talents, and Caesar's companions were sent off to raise the money. Caesar spent about 38 days with the pirates, and the whole time he acted like he was the one in charge. He told them to be quiet when he wanted to sleep. He participated in their games and exercises. He wrote poetry and speeches and made the pirates listen to them. And if they didn't appreciate his work, he called them illiterate barbarians. And the entire time, he told them that once he was free, he was going to come back and crucify every single one of them. The pirates thought this was hilarious. They treated it like a joke. Caesar was this young aristocrat making absurd threats while being their prisoner. It was entertaining. The ransom was paid. Caesar was released. And the first thing he did was raise a fleet, hunt down the pirates, capture them, and crucify them. Because Julius Caesar was not the kind of person who made idle threats. Although, in a moment of mercy that was apparently unusual for him, he had their throats cut before the crucifixion, so they died quicker. This was considered kind. By Roman standards, this was compassionate. The bar was very low. Climbing the ladder after dealing with the pirates and finishing his studies in Rhodes, Caesar returned to Rome around 73 BC. He was now in his late 20s, still not particularly wealthy, but building a reputation. He needed to start climbing the political ladder, which in Rome meant pursuing the cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices that every ambitious aristocrat had to navigate. The first real step was becoming a military tribune, which Caesar achieved. This was a relatively minor position, but it put him in the military structure and gave him some command experience. More importantly, it kept him visible and relevant in Roman society. In 69 BC, two important things happened. First, his wife Cornelia died. This was genuinely tragic. They'd been married for about 15 years, and by all accounts, they cared for each other. Caesar gave a public funeral oration for her, which was unusual. Funeral orations for young women were rare in Rome. Usually, only older women of exceptional status received them. But Caesar gave one for Cornelia anyway, and he used it to emphasize his connection to Marius and the populace faction, because even grief could be politically useful. The second thing that happened was that his aunt Julia died. Julia was Marius's widow, and she was an important link to the populace legacy. Caesar gave a public funeral oration for her too, and he went even further. He displayed images of Marius during the funeral procession. This was risky. Sulla had banned all public honors for Marius. Displaying his image was a direct challenge to the Sullan establishment that still controlled much of Rome's politics. But Caesar did it anyway, and the common people loved it. They remembered Marius as a hero, and here was his young relative publicly honoring him. It was brilliant political theater. That same year, Caesar was elected quaestor, which was the first major office in the cursus honorum. Quaestors handled financial administration and were assigned to various provinces or duties. Caesar was assigned to further Spain, which is basically the western part of the Iberian Peninsula. This was not a glamorous posting. Spain was relatively peaceful at this point, and the job was mostly administrative. But it got Caesar out of Rome again and gave him experience in provincial governance. While in Spain, Caesar supposedly had a moment of existential crisis. He saw a statue of Alexander the Great and reportedly broke down in tears because Alexander had conquered most of the known world by age 33. And here was Caesar, already past 30, having accomplished relatively little. Whether this actually happened or was invented later to make Caesar seem more ambitious and driven, we don't know. But it's a good story. When Caesar returned from Spain, he married again. His new wife was Pompeia, the granddaughter of Sulla. Yes, that Sulla, the dictator who had tried to kill him. This marriage was purely political. Caesar was aligning himself with one of the most prominent families in Rome, and the connection to Sulla's name still carried weight. It didn't matter that Caesar and Sulla had been on opposite sides. Politics makes strange bedfellows, as they say. In 65 BC, Caesar was elected aedile, which meant he was in charge of public works, festivals, and games. This was an important position because it gave you the opportunity to win popular support by putting on spectacular shows. And Caesar went all in. He spent absurd amounts of money on games and public entertainments, gladiatorial combats, theatrical performances, public feasts. He was trying to buy popularity, and it worked. The people loved him. The problem was that Caesar didn't actually have absurd amounts of money. He was going into massive debt to fund all of this. He was borrowing from everyone who would lend to him. This would become a pattern throughout his life. Caesar spent money he didn't have to achieve political goals, always betting that future success would allow him to pay back his debts. It was risky, but it worked more often than it didn't. During his time as aedile, Caesar also did something sneaky. He secretly restored the trophies and monuments honoring Marius that Sulla had torn down. He did this at night, so when people woke up in the morning, there they were, Marius's honors back on display. The optimates were furious. The common people were thrilled. Caesar was making himself the heir to Marius's legacy, and he was doing it in ways that were technically legal but deeply provocative. In 63 BC, Caesar ran for the position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. This was a huge deal. The Pontifex Maximus was the head of the state religion, a position of enormous prestige and influence that was held for life. Traditionally, it went to elder statesmen, men who had already served as consul and held the highest offices. Caesar was in his late 30s and hadn't even been praetor yet. It was absurd that he was running. He was up against two serious candidates, both much older and more established than him. The election was decided by the people, and Caesar campaigned aggressively. He also bribed shamelessly. He went even further into debt to pay for votes. On the morning of the election, he supposedly told his mother that he would either return as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all, because his debts were so massive that if he lost, he'd have to flee Rome to avoid his creditors. He won. Against all odds, Julius Caesar became Pontifex Maximus. He would hold this position for the rest of his life, and it gave him religious authority and immunity from certain legal prosecutions. It was a brilliant political victory, and it cemented his position as a major player in Roman politics. That same year, there was a major political crisis called the Catiline Conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina, known as Catiline, was an aristocrat who had failed to win the consulship and decided to overthrow the government instead. He gathered support from debtors, veterans, and other disaffected Romans, and planned to murder the consuls and seize power. The conspiracy was discovered and exposed by Cicero, who was consul at the time. The Senate debated what to do with the conspirators who had been captured. Cicero and the majority wanted them executed immediately without trial. Caesar, surprisingly, argued against execution. He gave a speech advocating for life imprisonment instead, arguing that executing Roman citizens without trial was unconstitutional and set a dangerous precedent. It was a principled stand, and it was also politically smart. Caesar was positioning himself as a defender of Roman rights against the Senate's overreach. But then Cato the Younger, one of the Senate's most stubborn traditionalists, gave a rebuttal that swayed the vote. He suggested that Caesar himself might be involved in the conspiracy, which was probably nonsense, but it was enough to create suspicion. The Senate voted for execution. The conspirators were strangled in prison. Cicero became a hero to the Optimates, and Caesar had taken a political hit by defending unpopular men, even though his legal argument was sound. The following year, 62 BC, Caesar was elected praetor. He was continuing his climb up the political ladder, but that year is more famous for a scandal that wrecked his marriage to Pompeia. There was a religious festival called the Bona Dea, which was exclusively for women. Men were absolutely forbidden from attending or even being in the house where it was held. The festival that year was at Caesar's house because, as Pontifex Maximus, he had official religious duties. Caesar left before the rituals began because he was male and not allowed to be there. A young aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher decided it would be funny to sneak into the festival disguised as a woman. Maybe he was trying to meet someone. Maybe he was just an idiot. Probably both. He was discovered, and it caused a massive scandal. The sanctity of the Bona Dea had been violated. Clodius was put on trial for sacrilege. Caesar's wife Pompeia was implicated in the scandal, with rumors suggesting she'd been having an affair with Clodius, or at least had helped him sneak in. Caesar divorced her immediately. When asked about it later, he gave the famous line, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." Here's the thing, though. When Clodius was put on trial, Caesar testified that he had no evidence of any wrongdoing. He didn't accuse Clodius of anything. He basically helped him get acquitted. So Caesar divorced his wife to protect his reputation, but he didn't actually pursue justice against the man who'd caused the scandal. It was all about appearances and political calculation. After his year as praetor, Caesar was assigned to govern further Spain again. And once again, he had a problem. His debts were so massive that his creditors literally wouldn't let him leave Rome until he paid them. He had borrowed from everyone, spent everything on political advancement, and now he couldn't even take up his provincial post without settling his accounts. This is where Marcus Licinius Crassus comes into the story. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, obscenely wealthy. He'd made his fortune in real estate, silver mining, and buying up property during Sulla's proscriptions when people were being murdered and their estates sold cheap. He was also politically ambitious, but not particularly charismatic or popular. He needed allies. Crassus paid off Caesar's debts, all of them. It was an enormous sum, something like 830 talents. In exchange, Caesar became Crassus's political ally and client. This was how Roman patronage worked. The rich man pays your debts, and you owe him loyalty and support. It was transactional, but it was also the system. With his debts cleared, Caesar went to Spain and spent the year governing the province. And for the first time in his life, he actually made some money. He led a military campaign against some rebellious tribes in the northwest, won some victories, and took a share of the plunder. Roman governors were expected to extract wealth from their provinces, and Caesar did exactly that. Not excessively by Roman standards, but enough to improve his financial situation. He also won the loyalty of his soldiers, which would prove important later. Caesar had a gift for connecting with common soldiers. He remembered their names, shared their hardships, rewarded them generously. He was building a power base, one legion at a time. When his term ended, Caesar rushed back to Rome, wanted to run for consul, the highest office in the Republic. But there was a problem. To run for consul, you had to be physically present in Rome to declare your candidacy. But Caesar's military victories in Spain qualified him for triumph, which was a massive ceremonial parade celebrating a general's achievements. To celebrate a triumph, you had to stay outside the city until the ceremony. Caesar asked the Senate if he could declare his candidacy in absentia without being physically present. The Senate, dominated by his enemies, said no. Caesar had to choose the triumph or the consulship. He chose the consulship. He gave up the triumph, entered Rome, and declared his candidacy for the consulship of 59 BC. And this is where things really start to get interesting. The first triumvirate and the consulship, Caesar needed support to win the consulship. Running for consul required money, political backing, and coalition building. Caesar had Crassus's support and money, but he needed more. So he engineered one of the most important political alliances in Roman history. He brought together Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey the Great. Pompey was the most successful general of his generation. He'd won major victories in Spain, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered much of the East, including parts of modern-day Turkey and Syria. He was a military legend, but when he returned to Rome, the Senate refused to ratify his eastern settlements and wouldn't provide land for his veterans. The optimates in the Senate didn't trust Pompey and were blocking his agenda out of spite and fear. Pompey was frustrated. Crassus was ambitious. Caesar needed both of them. So Caesar brokered a deal. The three of them would work together, pooling their resources and influence to achieve their individual goals. This became known as the First Triumvirate, though Romans called it a conspiracy or friendship, because there was no official title for what they were doing. It wasn't a legal office or formal alliance. It was a private political pact. Pompey would get his eastern settlements ratified and land for his veterans. Crassus would get favorable tax policies for the publicani, the tax collectors he had financial interests in, and Caesar would get elected consul, and then a major provincial command afterward. To seal the alliance, Caesar arranged for Pompey to marry his daughter Julia. Julia was in her early 20s, Pompey was in his mid-40s, and had already been married multiple times. But by all accounts, the marriage was actually happy. Pompey apparently adored Julia, and she seems to have been fond of him too. So that worked out better than most political marriages. With the triumvirate's backing, Caesar won the consulship for 59 BC. His co-consul was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a staunch optimate who hated Caesar. having two consuls who despised each other was supposed to create balance and prevent either from gaining too much power. In this case, it just meant constant conflict. Caesar's year as consul was chaotic. He pushed through legislation to grant land to Pompey's veterans, which the Senate had been blocking. He got Pompey's eastern settlements ratified. He passed laws favorable to Crassus's financial interests. And he did all of this by using aggressive and technically legal, but politically outrageous tactics. When the Senate wouldn't cooperate, Caesar took his legislation directly to the popular assemblies. He used Pompey's veterans to intimidate opponents. At one point, when Bibulus tried to veto Caesar's legislation, a mob dumped a bucket of excrement on Bibulus's head. Very mature, very Roman. Bibulus eventually gave up trying to govern alongside Caesar. He locked himself in his house for the rest of the year and just issued religious proclamations declaring that the omens were unfavorable for public business, which was supposed to invalidate any legislation passed. Nobody cared. Caesar ignored him and kept passing laws. People joked that the year should be dated not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but as the consulship of Julius and Caesar, because Caesar was effectively running everything alone. It was legally questionable, politically divisive, and wildly effective. Caesar got everything he wanted. He also made a lot of enemies. The Optimates hated him. The Senate establishment saw him as a demagogue and a threat to the Republic, which, to be fair, he kind of was. Before his consulship ended, Caesar secured his next assignment. Through the triumvirate's influence, he got himself appointed governor of 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. Cisalpine Gaul was northern Italy. Transalpine Gaul was southern France. Illyricum was the Adriatic coast, and the appointment wasn't for the usual 1-year term. It was for 5 years. This gave Caesar a massive power base, multiple legions under his command, and time to achieve something spectacular. What he was going to do with that time would change Roman history forever. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we get to Gaul, we need to talk about what was happening back in Rome, because Caesar left the city in 58 BC and wouldn't return for 9 years. And during those 9 years, the political situation back home would get increasingly unstable. One of Caesar's supporters, Publius Clodius Pulcher, yes, the same guy from the Bonadi scandal, got himself elected tribune in 58 BC. Clodius was a populist demagogue who used street gangs and mob violence to push his agenda. He passed laws distributing free grain to the poor, which made him wildly popular with the urban masses. He also went after Caesar's enemies. Clodius engineered the exile of Cicero, who had executed the Catiline conspirators without trial years earlier. Remember how Caesar had argued against that execution? Well, Clodius used it as grounds to prosecute Cicero for executing Roman citizens unconstitutionally. Cicero fled into exile rather than face trial. This was revenge and political housecleaning, and it showed that Caesar's allies were willing to use ruthless tactics to eliminate opposition. But But Clodius was also unpredictable and violent. His street gangs fought with rival gangs. Political violence became routine in Rome. The Republic's institutions were breaking down, unable to contain the conflicts between factions. The Senate was weak. The popular assemblies were being manipulated, and strongmen like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were accumulating more power than any individual was supposed to have. While this was happening, Caesar was in Gaul, and he was about to embark on 8 years of almost continuous warfare that would make him one of history's greatest military commanders, and also one of its most controversial conquerors. The Gallic Wars begin, so Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC with 4 legions under his command. Each legion was about 4,800 men, so he had roughly 20,000 soldiers to start with. His official mission was to govern the provinces and protect Roman interests. What he was really planning to do was conquer as much territory as possible, win military glory, and make himself indispensable to Rome. Gaul at this time was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of Celtic tribes, some friendly to Rome, some hostile, most just trying to survive. The Romans divided it roughly into 3 parts. There was Cisalpine Gaul, which was already Roman territory in northern Italy. There was Transalpine Gaul, which was a narrow strip of southern France that Rome controlled. And then there was the rest of Gaul, which the Romans called long-haired Gaul, because the Celts there apparently had fabulous hair, and the Romans were weirdly fixated on it. Caesar's governorship gave him control over Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul. Everything beyond that was technically independent. But Caesar wasn't the type to respect boundaries. The first year started with a crisis that gave Caesar the excuse he needed. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe living in what's now Switzerland, decided to migrate westward. Their territory was under pressure from Germanic tribes pushing in from the east, and they wanted to move to better land in Western Gaul. This mass migration would involve about 368,000 people, according to Caesar's own account, though that number is probably inflated because ancient sources loved exaggerating numbers. The Helvetii wanted to cross through Roman territory to reach their destination. Caesar said absolutely not. The Helvetii tried to go around, crossing through the lands of Rome's Gallic allies instead. Caesar said this was unacceptable because it threatened Rome's friends, gathered his legions, and intercepted the Helvetii. Now, here's the thing. The Helvetii migration might have been a genuine security concern, or it might have been a convenient pretext for Caesar to start a war. Probably both. Caesar was brilliant at finding justifications for his actions that made him look like he was defending Roman interests while also advancing his own goals. The campaign against the Helvetii lasted several months. There were skirmishes, forced marches, supply problems. Caesar's legions were professional soldiers, well-trained and disciplined. The Helvetii were migrants with women, children, and baggage trains. It wasn't a fair fight. The decisive battle happened nearby Bracte, a major Gallic settlement. Caesar's legions, probably around 30,000 men by this point, because he'd recruited more, faced the Helvetii warriors. The battle was brutal. The Helvetii fought fiercely, but they were outmatched by Roman tactics and equipment. Caesar's legions used their classic formations, rotating fresh troops to the front while tired soldiers fell back. It was grinding, efficient warfare. The Helvetii were crushed. According to Caesar's own account in his commentaries on the Gallic War, which he wrote to document and promote his achievements, out of the 368,000 Helvetii who started the migration, only 110,000 survived to return home. Those numbers are almost certainly exaggerated or inaccurate, but the point is clear. It was a catastrophe for the Helvetii. Caesar forced the survivors to return to their original territory. He couldn't have them settling in Gaul, where they might cause future problems. So the Helvetii went back to their lands in Switzerland, significantly fewer in number and thoroughly defeated. Caesar had won his first major victory in Gaul, but he wasn't done, not even close, because immediately after the Helvetii situation, another crisis emerged. And this one involved Germanic tribes, which the Romans feared even more than they feared the Gauls. Ariovistus was a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine with his warriors and was establishing himself in eastern Gaul. He'd been invited in by some Gallic tribes who wanted his help in their own tribal conflicts, which is a classic case of inviting in outside help and then realizing you can't get rid of them. Ariovistus was demanding tribute from Gallic tribes, taking hostages, and generally acting like a conqueror. The Gallic tribes appealed to Caesar for help. They told him that Ariovistus was a threat to Roman allies, and that if he wasn't stopped, more Germanic tribes would cross the Rhine and flood into Gaul. Caesar agreed to intervene. Again, this might have been a legitimate security concern, or it might have been Caesar looking for another war to fight. Probably both. Caesar sent messages to Ariovistus demanding that he stop threatening Rome's Gallic allies and stop bringing more Germanic tribes across the Rhine. Ariovistus basically told Caesar to mind his own business. He said he'd been invited into Gaul by the tribes themselves. He was the legitimate victor in their conflicts, and Rome had no authority to tell him what to do. Ariovistus wasn't wrong from a legal standpoint, but Caesar didn't care about legal standpoints. He cared about demonstrating Roman power and winning glory. So he marched his legions toward Ariovistus's position. The Romans were genuinely afraid of Germanic warriors. These were tall, fierce fighters who had destroyed Roman armies before. There were stories and legends about Germanic ferocity that scared even experienced Roman soldiers. As Caesar's army marched, there was apparently panic spreading through the ranks. Soldiers were writing their wills. Officers were making excuses to avoid battle. The fear was real. Caesar dealt with this in typical Caesar fashion. He gave a speech to his troops, shaming them for their cowardice and reminding them of Roman superiority. He said that if necessary, he would march with only the 10th Legion, his most loyal unit, and leave the cowards behind. This worked. The soldiers rallied, ashamed of their fear and motivated by their general's confidence. It was masterful leadership and psychological manipulation. Battle against Ariovistus happened somewhere in Alsace, probably near modern-day Mulhouse. The Germanic warriors were formidable. They fought in dense formations with overlocked shields, creating what the Romans called a phalanx. They were physically imposing and fought with berserker-like intensity. But the Romans adapted. Caesar's legionaries charged the Germanic lines so quickly that they got inside their spear range, forcing hand-to-hand combat where Roman training and equipment gave them an advantage. The Germanic left flank broke first. Then their center collapsed. It turned into a rout. Ariovistus fled back across the Rhine with the survivors of his army. Both of his wives were killed in the battle. 2 of his daughters were captured. It was a complete Roman victory. Caesar had defeated the Germanic threat and secured Eastern Gaul. More importantly, he'd proven that Germanic warriors, despite their fearsome reputation, could be beaten by disciplined Roman legions. All of this happened in 58 BC. Caesar's first year in Gaul, he defeated the Helvetii and Ariovistus, fought 2 major campaigns, and massively expanded Roman influence in the region. And he was just getting started. The Gallic tribes were starting to realize that inviting Roman protection was a double-edged sword. Sure, Caesar had saved them from the Helvetii and Ariovistus, but now there were Roman legions camped in Gaul, and Caesar showed no signs of leaving. Deeper into Gaul the next year, 57 BC, Caesar decided to deal with the Belgae, the tribes living in northern Gaul, in what's now Belgium and northern France. The Belgae were considered the fiercest and most warlike of all the Gallic peoples. They were also forming a confederation to resist Roman expansion, which Caesar couldn't allow. Caesar's justification for attacking the Belgae was that they were planning to invade Roman territory. Whether this was true or just Caesar being proactive about eliminating potential threats, we don't really know. What we do know is that Caesar marched north with his legions, recruited 2 new legions to bring his total to 6, and prepared for another campaign. The Belgic Confederation included tribes like the Nervii, the Atrebates, the Ambieni, and others. They could supposedly field around 300,000 warriors, though again, ancient numbers are unreliable. What mattered was that there were a lot of them, and they were ready to fight. The campaign started with Caesar besieging the town of Novaeoginum, which belonged to the Susians tribe. The siege was quick and brutal. The Romans built fortifications, brought up siege equipment, and the Susians surrendered rather than face destruction. Other Belgic tribes started submitting without fighting, realizing that resistance was probably futile. But the Nervii weren't interested in surrendering. They were fierce warriors who prided themselves on their toughness and rejection of luxury. They didn't allow wine or other foreign goods into their territory because they thought it made men soft. They were basically the Spartans of Gaul, except Celtic and probably with better hair. The Nervii, along with their allies the Atrebates and Viromandui, decided to ambush Caesar's army. They waited until the Romans were making camp near the Sambre River, when the legions were divided and vulnerable. The baggage train was separated from the main force, and the soldiers were were busy building fortifications instead of standing in battle formation. The Nervii attacked from the forest with incredible speed. They charged across the river and hit the Roman camp before the legions could properly organize. It was chaos. Different legions were scattered across the camp, some not even in formation yet. The Nervii were inside the Roman lines, fighting hand to hand with soldiers who were still grabbing their weapons. This was one of the closest calls Caesar ever had in Gaul. His army was on the verge of being destroyed. But Caesar personally grabbed a shield, pushed his way to the front lines, and rallied his troops. He combined the depleted 11th and 12th legions into one unit and led them into the fight. His presence stabilized the situation just enough. Meanwhile, the 10th Legion, Caesar's favorites, hit the Nervii from the flank. The two fresh legions that had been with the baggage train arrived and attacked from the rear. The Nervii were surrounded, but they didn't run. They kept fighting even as they were being slaughtered. Caesar describes them fighting, literally standing on piles of their own dead, throwing Roman javelins back at the legions. The Nervii were nearly exterminated. Out of supposedly 60,000 warriors, only 500 survived, according to Caesar's account. The tribe's council of 600 elders was reduced to 3. It was genocide dressed up as military victory. The Nervii had fought with incredible bravery, and they were destroyed for it. The rest of the Belgic tribes submitted after that. You would too if you saw what happened to the people who resisted. By the end of 57 BC, Caesar claimed he had pacified all of Gaul. He sent reports to Rome describing his victories and the expansion of Roman power. The Senate declared 20 days of thanksgiving in his honor, which was an unprecedented length of celebration. Caesar was becoming a hero back home. But of course, Gaul wasn't actually pacified. Conquered people don't just accept their subjugation quietly, especially when the conquest was brutal and ongoing. In 56 BC, Caesar dealt with tribes on the Atlantic coast. The Veneti, a seafaring people in what's now Brittany, rebelled against Roman control. They held some of Caesar's officers hostage and allied with other coastal tribes to resist. The Veneti were a problem because they lived on the coast and had a powerful fleet. Their ships were designed for the rough Atlantic waters, built with oak hulls and leather sails. Roman ships were designed for the calmer Mediterranean and weren't as sturdy. Naval warfare in the Atlantic was a challenge the Romans hadn't faced before. Caesar built a fleet anyway. He put Decimus Brutus in charge of the ships and prepared for Rome's first major Atlantic naval battle. The Romans couldn't ram the Veneti ships effectively because the hulls were too strong. They couldn't board them easily because the Veneti ships had higher decks. So the Romans adapted. They created hooks on long poles that could cut the ropes holding the Veneti ship's sails. Without sails, the ships were immobile, and the Romans could surround and board them. The battle happened near the coast, in front of Caesar's army, which was watching from the shore. The wind died down at a critical moment, leaving the Veneti ships dead in the water. The Romans systematically disabled and captured the Veneti fleet. It was a complete victory. Caesar's response to the Veneti rebellion was harsh. He had their entire council of elders executed and sold the remaining population into slavery. This was meant to send a message to other tribes. Rebellion would not be tolerated. The consequences would be severe. That same year, Caesar sent one of his officers, Publius Crassus, son of Marcus Crassus, to subjugate the tribes in Aquitania in southwestern Gaul. Meanwhile, Caesar himself campaigned against Germanic tribes who had crossed the Rhine. He was constantly moving, constantly fighting, keeping his legions busy and expanding Roman control. Caesar was also writing. Every year, he was composing his commentaries on the Gallic War, a first-hand account of the campaigns. These were sent back to Rome and circulated among the literate classes. They were brilliantly written, clear, and engaging, making Caesar's victories accessible to people who had never seen a battle. They were also propaganda. Caesar always presented himself as acting in Rome's best interests, defending allies, and responding to threats. He was crafting his own legend in real time. Back in Rome, the political situation was getting messier. The triumvirate was starting to strain. Pompey and Crassus didn't really trust each other. Caesar's enemies in the Senate were looking for ways to undermine him. There were rumors that once Caesar's provincial command ended, he would be prosecuted for his illegal actions during his consulship. In 56 BC, the three members of the triumvirate met at Lucca, a town in northern Italy, to reassert their alliance. They made a new agreement. Pompey and Crassus would be consuls again in 55 BC. After their consulship, Pompey would get control of Spain, and Crassus would get Syria. Caesar's command in Gaul would be extended for another 5 years, giving him until 50 BC. This was oligarchy masquerading as republic. 3 men were dividing up Rome's provinces and offices among themselves. The Senate was essentially powerless to stop them. The republic's institutions were being hollowed out by personal ambition and backroom deals. But the arrangement held for a while longer. Pompey and Crassus became consuls in 55 BC and pushed through the legislation they'd agreed on. Caesar got his extension in Gaul. Everything was set for another 5 years of conquest and political maneuvering. And then Caesar did something audacious. He decided to cross the Rhine and invade Germania. Beyond the Rhine and across the Channel, the Rhine River was the boundary between Gaul and Germania. It was a psychological and physical barrier. Romans didn't go into Germania unless they absolutely had to. The place was full of fierce Germanic tribes, dense forests, and bad memories of Roman defeats. But Caesar wanted to make a statement. Some Germanic tribes had been raiding across the Rhine into Gaul. They were attacking Gallic tribes that were now under Roman protection. Caesar decided this was unacceptable. But instead of just defending the border, he decided to cross the Rhine and attack the Germanic tribes in their own territory. Building a bridge across the Rhine was a massive engineering project. The river was wide, fast-flowing, and deep. Caesar's engineers constructed a timber bridge in 10 days, which was an impressive feat of Roman engineering. bridge was built with massive wooden pilings driven into the riverbed, reinforced with crossbeams and supports. It was sturdy enough for legions to march across. Caesar marched his army into Germania. The Germanic tribes were shocked. They'd probably expected the Romans to sit behind the Rhine and defend their border, not come across and invade. Many tribes retreated deeper into the forests. Caesar's army burned some villages, destroyed some crops, and generally made a show of Roman power. Then, after 18 days in Germania, Caesar marched his army back across the Rhine and destroyed the bridge behind him. The whole expedition was symbolic. Caesar wasn't trying to conquer Germania. He was demonstrating that Rome could reach across the Rhine whenever it wanted. It was intimidation and spectacle. But Caesar wasn't done with his theatrical demonstrations. Later that same year, 55 BC, he decided to invade Britain. Britain was almost mythical to the Romans. It was an island at the edge of the known world, shrouded in mist and mystery. Julius Caesar himself admitted that almost nothing was known about Britain's interior, its peoples, or its geography. There were rumors of tin mines and pearls, and all sorts of exotic resources. There were also rumors that British tribes were supporting Gallic resistance to Rome, which may or may not have been true. Caesar launched his first British expedition late in the campaigning season, which was not ideal timing. He assembled a fleet of transport ships and warships and crossed the English Channel with 2 legions. The crossing was rough. The weather was bad. The tides were unpredictable. When the Roman fleet approached the British coast near Dover, they found cliffs lined with British warriors ready to oppose the landing. Caesar sailed along the coast looking for a better landing spot. He eventually landed on an open beach, probably near Deal. But the British were waiting there too. The Romans had to jump from their ships into the surf, wade through the water while being attacked by British warriors throwing spears and shooting arrows, and fight their way onto the beach. It was difficult and chaotic. According to Caesar's account, the Romans hesitated. They were afraid to jump from the ships into the water while being attacked. Then the standard bearer of the 10th Legion jumped into the surf, holding the legion's eagle standard, and shouted for his comrades to follow unless they wanted to lose their eagle to the enemy. The Romans surged forward, fought their way ashore, and established a beachhead. It's a great story. It's also exactly the kind of story that makes for good propaganda. Whether it actually happened that way, we can't be sure. But it's in Caesar's commentaries, so that's what people in Rome heard. The first British expedition was not a success. The Romans were stuck on the beach, unable to advance far inland. Their cavalry transports got scattered by storms and never made it across the channel, leaving the legions without cavalry support. The British used chariots in battle, which the Romans found weird and difficult to counter. And then a massive storm damaged a large portion of Caesar's fleet, wrecking ships and making it impossible to retreat if necessary. Caesar's legions repaired the ships as best they could, fought a few skirmishes with the British tribes, accepted the nominal submission of some local leaders, took some hostages, and then retreated back to Gaul before winter, weather made crossing the channel impossible. It was barely an invasion, more like a raid, but Caesar reported it to Rome as a great victory, the first Roman general to cross the ocean and bring Rome's power to Britain. The Senate declared another 20 days of thanksgiving. Never mind that Caesar had accomplished almost nothing concrete. The spectacle was what mattered. The next year, 54 BC, Caesar tried again. This time, he was better prepared. He built a larger fleet, about 800 ships according to his account. He brought 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. This was a serious invasion force. The second British expedition went better initially. The Romans landed without opposition because the size of the fleet apparently intimidated the British tribes into withdrawing from the coast. Caesar marched inland, crossed the Thames River, and fought several battles against British tribes led by Cassivellaunus, a powerful chieftain. The British used guerrilla tactics. They harassed the Roman supply lines, used their chariots to strike quickly and retreat, and avoided pitched battles where Roman discipline would give them an advantage. Cassivellaunus had disbanded most of his infantry and kept only his chariots and cavalry, using hit and run tactics to wear down the Romans. Eventually, Caesar captured an important British stronghold, probably near modern-day Hertfordshire. Other tribes started abandoning Cassivellaunus and submitting to Rome. Cassivellaunus himself negotiated terms. He agreed to pay tribute to Rome, provide hostages, and promised not to attack the Trinovantes tribe, who were now Roman allies. Caesar accepted these terms and withdrew back to Gaul. Again, he claimed victory. Again, it was mostly symbolic. The tribute was never paid. The hostages were probably returned or escaped. Britain remained independent. But Caesar had crossed the ocean twice and brought Roman eagles to the distant island. That was enough for propaganda purposes. What Caesar had really accomplished was cementing his reputation as a daring commander, willing to go where no Roman had gone before. The Rhine Bridge and the British expeditions were spectacles that made him famous and kept his name in the public consciousness back in Rome. But while Caesar was off invading Britain, things were starting to go wrong in Gaul. Rebellion and disaster. The Gallic tribes were getting tired of Roman occupation. The legions were demanding supplies, taking hostages, executing leaders, and generally acting like conquerors, which they were. But conquered people eventually resist. In 54 BC, while Caesar was still in Britain, some of the Belgic tribes in northern Gaul started causing problems. When Caesar returned, he had to spread his legions across the region in winter camps because there wasn't enough grain in one place to feed the entire army. This was normal procedure, but it made the legions vulnerable. One of the camps was held by a legion and a half under the command of Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta. They were camped in the territory of the Eburones tribe. The Eburones, led by their king Ambiorix, convinced Sabinus and Cotta that a massive Germanic force was coming to attack, and that the Romans should abandon their camp and join up with another legion for safety. This was a trap. Sabinus believed Ambiorix and convinced Cotta to abandon the camp. As the Romans marched through the forest, the Eburones and their allies ambushed them. The Roman column was strung out, vulnerable, and caught by surprise. The Gauls massacred them. Sabinus tried to negotiate, walked up to meet Ambiorix under a flag of truce, and was killed. Cotta was wounded and died fighting. The entire Roman force, about 7,000 men, was wiped out. Almost no one survived. This was the worst Roman defeat in Gaul since Caesar's campaigns began. A legion and a half completely destroyed. It emboldened other tribes to rebel. The Nervii, who had been nearly exterminated 3 years earlier, attacked another Roman camp commanded by Quintus Cicero, the brother of the famous orator. Cicero's camp was besieged by tens of thousands of Gauls. The Romans built fortifications and held out desperately, but they were outnumbered and running low on supplies. Cicero managed to get a message to Caesar, who was with another legion some distance away. Caesar marched immediately with about 7,000 men to relieve Cicero. He was outnumbered by the Gallic forces besieging the camp, but he used deception. He made his small force look like an easy target, luring the Gauls away from Cicero's camp to attack him instead. When the Gauls attacked, Caesar revealed his full strength and ambushed them. The Gauls were routed, and Cicero's camp was saved. But the damage was done. The Gauls had proven that Romans could be defeated, that Roman legions could be destroyed. Ambiorix became a hero among the Gallic tribes. Caesar's conquests suddenly looked less permanent. Caesar spent the winter of 54-53 BC dealing with the crisis. He recruited new legions to replace the losses. He borrowed a legion from Pompey. He moved aggressively against the rebellious tribes, particularly the Eburones. Caesar's campaign against the Eburones was brutal even by his standards. He systematically devastated their territory, burning villages, destroying crops, killing, or enslaving anyone he found. He invited neighboring tribes to join in the plundering, essentially encouraging them to help exterminate the Eburones. Ambiorix escaped. Caesar never caught him, which must have frustrated him immensely. But the Eburones as a tribe were effectively destroyed. They ceased to exist as a coherent people. It was meant to send a message. This is what happens when you defeat a Roman legion. In 53 BC, Caesar crossed the Rhine again, building another bridge and conducting another punitive expedition into Germania. Again, it was more about demonstrating power than achieving concrete objectives. He was showing that Roman authority extended wherever Rome chose to extend it. But the political situation back in Rome was deteriorating. The triumvirate was falling apart. In 53 BC, Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome and one of the 3 triumvirs, decided he needed military glory to match Pompey and Caesar. He took his legions to Syria and launched an invasion of Parthia, the great empire to the east. It was a disaster. The Parthians used horse archers who could shoot arrows while riding at full gallop. They encircled Crassus's legions at Carrhae and massacred them. The Roman soldiers couldn't get close enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat, where they had the advantage. They just stood in formation while arrows rained down on them for hours. Thousands died. Crassus tried to negotiate with the Parthian commanders and was killed during the meeting, possibly treacherously, possibly just in the chaos. His head was cut off and sent to the Parthian king. About 20,000 Roman soldiers died at Carrhae. Another 10,000 were captured and marched off into slavery in the far reaches of the Parthian Empire. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Crassus's death meant the triumvirate was now just two people, Caesar and Pompey. And without Crassus as a buffer between them, the relationship started to fall apart. Then, in 54 BC, Caesar's daughter Julia died in childbirth. She was Pompey's wife, and she'd been the personal link between Caesar and Pompey. With her death, that connection was gone. Pompey had genuinely loved Julia. Her death affected him deeply, and politically, it removed one of the main reasons for Pompey to stay loyal to Caesar. The Senate, seeing an opportunity, started courting Pompey. They offered him honors and positions. They flattered him. They reminded him that he was the greatest general of his generation, beloved by the Senate and the people. They subtly suggested that Caesar was becoming too powerful, too dangerous. That Caesar's continued command in Gaul threatened the Republic. Pompey started to listen. The Great Revolt in 52 BC, Gaul exploded into the largest and most coordinated rebellion Caesar had faced. This wasn't just one tribe causing problems. This was multiple tribes across Gaul uniting against Roman occupation. And they found a leader. His name was Vercingetorix. He was a young nobleman from the Arverni tribe in central Gaul, charismatic, intelligent, and capable of uniting tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other. He convinced the Gallic tribes that they could only defeat Rome if they worked together. And for the first time, many of them listened. Vercingetorix's strategy was smart. Instead of fighting pitched battles where Roman discipline would give them an advantage, the Gauls would use scorched earth tactics. They would burn their own towns and crops, deny the Romans supplies, and harass their supply lines. They would wear down the legions through attrition rather than confrontation. The rebellion started in the winter, which was unusual. Gallic tribes normally didn't campaign in winter, but Vercingetorix wanted to catch the Romans off guard. Caesar was south of the Alps in Cisalpine Gaul, separated from his legions by the Massif Central Mountains, which were covered in deep snow and supposedly impassable in winter. Caesar did the impossible. He crossed the mountains in winter with a small force, demonstrating that Roman determination could overcome natural barriers. He rejoined his legions and prepared to put down the rebellion. The campaign of 52 BC was the hardest fighting Caesar had faced in Gaul. Vercingetorix was a competent commander who avoided Caesar's strengths and exploited his weaknesses. The Gauls burned Avaricum, one of their major towns, to deny it to the Romans. They burned Novioginum and its supplies. They were willing to destroy their own cities to resist Rome. But the Gallic Confederacy wasn't perfectly unified. Some tribes wanted to protect their towns instead of burning them. At Avaricum, the Bituriges tribe begged Vercingetorix to spare their city. It was one of the most beautiful in Gaul, they said. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed. Caesar besieged Avaricum. The siege lasted 25 days. The Romans built massive siege works, raising their approach ramps and towers despite constant rain and Gallic attacks. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they were furious from the difficult siege and massacred the population. Out of 40,000 people in the city, only about 800 escaped according to Caesar's account. It was a brutal victory, but it backfired strategically. The massacre at Avaricum convinced other Gallic tribes that Roman victory meant death or slavery. It hardened their resolve to fight. Vercingetorix withdrew to Gergovia, the main settlement of the Arverni. Caesar followed and laid siege, but Gergovia was on a high plateau, easily defensible. The siege went badly. Caesar tried to storm the town and was repulsed with heavy casualties. It was one of his rare tactical defeats. The 6th Legion's standard bearer was killed. The legion lost its eagle, though they managed to recover it. Caesar was forced to withdraw from Gergovia. This was a major blow to Roman prestige. Caesar had been defeated. The invincible Roman legions had failed to take a Gallic stronghold. More tribes joined Vercingetorix's rebellion. Even some of Rome's longest standing Gallic allies defected. The entire conquest of Gaul was suddenly in jeopardy. Caesar consolidated his forces. He had about 10 legions by now, plus Germanic cavalry he'd hired from across the Rhine. Vercingetorix tried to cut off Caesar's line of retreat and trap him in Gaul. There was a massive cavalry battle near the Vingine River, where Caesar's Germanic cavalry defeated the Gallic horse. Vercingetorix withdrew to the fortified town of Alesia. And this is where Caesar made one of the most audacious military decisions in history. Alesia was on top of a hill, surrounded by other hills and valleys. It was highly defensible. Vercingetorix had about 80,000 warriors inside the town. Caesar couldn't storm it successfully. So instead, he decided to surround it completely and starve them out. But Caesar knew that Vercingetorix had sent word to all the tribes in Gaul to raise a relief army and come break the siege. That relief army would supposedly number somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000 warriors, according to Caesar's account. Even if that number is exaggerated, it was huge. So Caesar built 2 sets of fortifications. The inner ring, called the circumvallation, surrounded Alesia and prevented anyone inside from escaping. The outer ring, called the contravallation, faced outward to defend against the coming relief army. The fortifications included trenches, walls, towers, traps, stakes, and every defensive measure Roman engineering could devise. The perimeter was about 11 miles long for the inner ring and 14 miles for the outer ring. Caesar's army was now sandwiched between Vercingetorix's forces in Alesia and the massive relief army approaching from outside. If the relief army and Vercingetorix coordinated their attacks, Caesar's legions would be crushed between them. The relief army arrived. The numbers Caesar gives are probably inflated, but even a conservative estimate puts them at over 100,000 warriors. They attacked Caesar's fortifications repeatedly. Vercingetorix attacked from inside Alesia at the same time. The Romans fought on two fronts simultaneously, defending their walls against overwhelming numbers. The battle lasted for days. There were cavalry engagements, infantry assaults, desperate last stands. At one point, a Gallic force nearly broke through Caesar's fortifications on the northwestern side. Caesar personally led reinforcements to that section, identifiable by his distinctive scarlet general's cloak. His presence rallied the legions, and they held the line. The Gauls made one final massive assault on the weakest point in Caesar's fortifications. If they broke through, the entire Roman position would collapse. Caesar sent his German cavalry around behind the Gallic lines to attack them from the rear. The timing was perfect. The Gauls were caught between the Roman fortifications and the cavalry charge. They broke and fled. The relief army disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls retreated, their confederation shattered. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix knew it was over. He'd run out of food. His people were starving. The relief army had failed. There was no escape. Vercingetorix surrendered. According to the traditional account, he dressed in his finest armor, rode out of Alesia, circled around Caesar, and then dismounted and laid down his arms at Caesar's feet without speaking a word. It was a dramatic, dignified surrender. Caesar had him arrested and held prisoner. Vercingetorix would spend the next 6 years in a Roman prison waiting. Caesar was saving him for a triumph back in Rome. The victory at Alesia effectively ended the Gallic Wars. There would be some mopping up in 51 and 50 BC, some scattered resistance, but Gaul as a whole was conquered. Caesar had subdued hundreds of tribes, killed or enslaved millions of people, and brought vast new territories under Roman control. His commentaries estimate that he fought against 3 million Gauls, killed 1 million, and enslaved another million. Modern historians think these numbers are inflated, but even if you cut them in half, the scale of death and destruction was enormous. Caesar had committed something close to genocide in his conquest of Gaul, but in Rome, he was a hero. His military achievements were celebrated. His wealth from the Gallic plunder was legendary. He'd become one of the most famous men in the Roman world. He'd also become one of the most dangerous, because now Caesar had an army that was absolutely loyal to him personally. His legions had spent years fighting under his command. He'd made them rich through plunder. He'd won them glory. They would follow Caesar anywhere, even if anywhere meant marching on Rome itself. The point of no return, so Caesar had conquered Gaul, become fabulously wealthy, and commanded an army that was personally loyal to him. Back in Rome, the Senate was getting increasingly nervous, which makes sense when you think about it. Here's a man who had bent the rules during his consulship, spent nearly a decade waging wars that expanded Roman territory massively, and now controlled multiple legions of battle-hardened soldiers. That's a lot of power for one person in a republic that was theoretically supposed to prevent anyone from accumulating that much power. The political situation in Rome had deteriorated significantly during Caesar's time in Gaul. The violence that had been simmering throughout the 50s BC finally boiled over. Clodius and Milo, two rival political thugs who commanded street gangs, were engaged in an escalating conflict that made Rome's streets genuinely dangerous. In 52 BC, the same year as the Siege of Alesia, Clodius and Milo encountered each other on the Appian Way outside Rome. Their gangs fought, and Clodius was killed. The Roman mob rioted. They took Clodius's body to the Senate house and cremated him there, burning down the building in the process. The Senate house, one of the most important buildings in Rome, just gone. It was chaos. The Senate, desperate for order, did something extraordinary. They appointed Pompey as sole consul. Not two consuls, as tradition demanded, just Pompey, consul without colleague. It was essentially a legal dictatorship, though they didn't call it that. Pompey restored order, tried, and executed some of the worst offenders of the political violence, and generally stabilized the situation. But in doing so, he became even more powerful and more closely aligned with the Senate's conservative faction. Pompey had always been a bit of a political chameleon. He'd supported Sulla, then broken with the Sullans. He'd allied with Caesar and Crassus, and now he was drifting toward the Optimates. With Crassus dead and Julia gone, there was nothing tying him to Caesar except mutual self-interest. And increasingly, Pompey's self-interest lay in distancing himself from Caesar and presenting himself as the defender of the Republic against Caesar's ambitions. Caesar's command in Gaul was set to expire in 50 BC. Enemies in the Senate, particularly Cato the Younger and the other hardline Optimates, wanted Caesar to give up his provinces and his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Once he was a private citizen, they could prosecute him for the illegal acts he'd committed during his consulship back in 59 BC. And there were a lot of illegal acts to choose from. The prosecutions would be politically motivated show trials, but they'd be legal. Caesar could be ruined, exiled, or worse. Caesar wanted to transition directly from his provincial command to another consulship. If he was consul, he'd have immunity from prosecution. But the Senate said no. The law required a 10-year interval between consulships, and even though Caesar's supporters argued that he should be allowed to run in absentia, the Senate refused. The debate dragged on through 51 and 50 BC. Caesar offered compromises. He said he'd give up his provinces if Pompey gave up his. Pompey refused. Caesar said he'd give up all his provinces except Cisalpine Gaul and keep just one legion. The Senate refused. Hardliners like Cato didn't want compromise. They wanted Caesar stripped of power and made vulnerable to prosecution. The tribune Mark Antony, who was Caesar's supporter, kept vetoing the Senate's attempts to remove Caesar's command. This was legal. Tribunes had veto power, but it just made the situation more deadlocked and tense. By late 50 BC, it was clear that a political solution was impossible. The Senate passed a decree that Caesar must disband his army by a certain date or be declared an enemy of the state. Mark Antony and another tribune, Quintus Cassius Longinus, vetoed it. The Senate responded by passing the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, which essentially authorized the consuls to take any measures necessary to preserve the state. This was the nuclear option of Roman politics, used only in the most extreme emergencies. Mark Antony and Cassius fled Rome and joined Caesar, who was waiting in Ravenna with one of his legions. Caesar now had a choice. He could disband his army, return to Rome, and face almost certain prosecution and political destruction. Or he could march on Rome with his army and start a civil war. The choice was probably inevitable from the start. Caesar had spent his entire life accumulating power. He'd gone into massive debt, fought wars, risked death, and built an empire in Gaul. He wasn't going to throw all of that away to be prosecuted by his enemies in a sham trial. On January 10, 49 BC, Caesar made his decision. He led the 13th Legion south from Ravenna toward the Rubicon River. The Rubicon was the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul, where Caesar had legal authority, and Italy proper, where he didn't. Roman law absolutely forbade a general from bringing his army across the Rubicon into Italy. To do so was treason. It was an act of war against the Republic itself. Caesar supposedly hesitated at the river. According to the historian Suetonius, he stood there thinking about the consequences. Crossing meant civil war. Not crossing meant political death. He quoted a Greek phrase, alia iacta est, the die is cast, and then he crossed. The Republic was finished. Not officially, not immediately, but the moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legion, the old Roman Republic that had existed for nearly 500 years was effectively dead. What would emerge from the coming civil war would be something different, something that looked like a republic but functioned like a monarchy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Civil war begins when news reached Rome that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and was marching south with his army. There was panic. People expected Caesar to sack the city, to unleash his veteran legions on Rome like a barbarian conqueror. Pompey and the consuls and most of the Senate fled. They abandoned Rome without a fight and headed south toward Brundisium, where they planned to cross to Greece and raise an army. But Caesar didn't sack Rome. He didn't even march directly on the city. Instead, he moved rapidly down the Italian peninsula, capturing towns as he went. And here's the interesting thing. He didn't massacre anyone. He didn't plunder. When towns surrendered, he treated them with clemency. When he captured enemy soldiers, he let them go. This was his deliberate policy. Clementia, mercy. Caesar was trying to position himself not as a tyrant or a conqueror, but as a defender of his rights and the rights of the tribunes who had been forced to flee. He claimed he was fighting to restore the dignity of the Republic, to oppose the faction that had illegally driven him to war. Whether he believed this or whether it was just brilliant propaganda, it worked. Towns opened their gates. Enemy soldiers defected. People who had expected a monster found a man offering peace and clemency. Pompey retreated to Brundisium with his forces. Caesar pursued and besieged the city, but Pompey managed to evacuate his army across the Adriatic to Greece before Caesar could trap him. Caesar now controlled Italy. But Pompey was gathering strength in the east, where he had extensive client networks and resources from his previous campaigns. Caesar couldn't immediately pursue Pompey across the Adriatic because Pompey controlled the seas. The Pompeian fleet was much larger and more experienced than anything Caesar could quickly assemble. So Caesar made a strategic decision. He would deal with Pompey's forces in Spain first, then return to handle Pompey himself. But first, he needed to legitimize his position. In April 49 BC, Caesar returned to Rome. The city was largely empty. Most of the Senate had fled with Pompey, but Caesar gathered whoever was left and had them name him dictator. This was a legal Roman office used in emergencies. A dictator had supreme authority for a limited time, usually 6 months. It gave Caesar's actions a veneer of legality. He held the dictatorship just long enough to hold elections and get himself elected consul for 48 BC. Then he resigned the dictatorship and marched to Spain as consul. See, technically, he was following the law. He was consul. He had authority. Never mind that he'd achieved this through military force and political manipulation. The forms were observed. That mattered to Romans. The campaign in Spain was quick and relatively bloodless. Pompey had left several legions there under his lieutenants. Caesar outmaneuvered them, cut off their supplies, and forced them to surrender at Ilerda. Again, he showed clemency. He pardoned the soldiers and officers and let them go. Some of them would later fight against him again, but in the moment, it reinforced his image as a merciful leader fighting a defensive war. With Spain secured, Caesar returned to Rome, and then prepared to cross into Greece to face Pompey directly. This was risky. Pompey had spent the year raising an enormous army. He had 9 legions to Caesar's 7, and his legions were well supplied and supported by local allies. He also controlled the sea, which made supplying Caesar's army difficult. Caesar crossed the Adriatic in January 48 BC, sailing during the stormy winter season when Pompey's fleet wasn't expecting anyone to cross. It was dangerous, but it worked. Caesar landed in Greece with about 7 legions. Mark Antony was supposed to follow with the rest of the army, but the Pompeian fleet was now alerted and blockading the crossing. For months, Caesar was stuck in Greece with only half his forces, unable to bring across the rest. He tried to besiege Pompey at Dyrrhachium, but Pompey had more men and better supplies. The siege turned into a disaster for Caesar. Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's fortifications and inflicted serious casualties. Caesar was forced to retreat. It was one of his worst defeats. Caesar's army was in bad shape. They were low on supplies, exhausted, and demoralized from the defeat at Dyrrhachium. But then Pompey made a mistake. Instead of pursuing Caesar aggressively and finishing him off, Pompey hesitated. He was cautious, maybe too cautious. He gave Caesar time to regroup and retreat into Thessaly. The 2 armies finally met at Pharsalus in August 48 BC. Pompey had about 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had about 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Pompey had the numerical advantage, and the support of most of the Senate. On paper, he should have won, but Caesar was the better tactical commander. Pompey's plan was to use his superior cavalry to outflank Caesar's right wing and attack from behind. Caesar anticipated this. He secretly positioned a fourth line of cohorts behind his cavalry, instructed to hold their javelins, and thrust them at the faces of Pompey's cavalry when they charged. It was unconventional, but it worked. When Pompey's cavalry charged, Caesar's hidden cohorts emerged and attacked with their javelins aimed at the riders' faces. The cavalry panicked and fled. This exposed Pompey's left flank. Caesar's cavalry and the fourth line wheeled around and attacked Pompey's main force from the side and rear. The Pompeian legions broke and ran. It was a complete victory. Pompey's army was shattered. About 6,000 Pompeians died, and another 24,000 surrendered. Caesar lost only about 200 men according to his own account, though that number is suspiciously low and probably propaganda. Pompey fled the battlefield. He rode to the coast, boarded a ship, and sailed east. He was heading to Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge and support from the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was technically Rome's ally, and Pompey had helped Ptolemy's father years earlier. Surely they would help him. Caesar pursued. He landed in Egypt a few days after Pompey at the port of Alexandria, and that's where he received shocking news. Pompey was dead. Ptolemy's advisors had decided that supporting Pompey was risky, but killing him and giving his head to Caesar would win favor. So when Pompey's boat approached the shore, Ptolemy's men greeted him, invited him into a small boat, and then stabbed him to death in front of his wife and children, who were watching from the ship. They cut off his head and preserved it to present to Caesar. When Caesar arrived, they brought him Pompey's severed head and signet ring as gifts. According to some sources, Caesar wept. Whether this was genuine grief for a former friend and son-in-law, or political theater, or just shock at the undignified end of Rome's greatest general, we don't know. But Caesar had Pompey's remains properly cremated and sent the ashes back to Pompey's wife. He also executed the men who had killed Pompey, which was either noble or hypocritical, depending on how you look at it. Caesar would have killed Pompey eventually, either in battle or through proscription, but he wanted it done with Roman dignity, not assassinated by foreign schemers. Caesar in Egypt. Caesar was now in Egypt, which was technically an independent kingdom, but heavily influenced by Rome. Egypt was rich, strategically important, and currently in the middle of a civil war of its own. The pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who was maybe 13 or 14 years old, was fighting with his sister wife Cleopatra VII for control of the kingdom. Yes, sister wife. The Ptolemies were Greek descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, and they'd adopted the Egyptian royal practice of sibling marriage to keep the bloodline pure. It was standard practice for them, weird by Roman standards, but the Ptolemies had been doing it for centuries. Cleopatra had been forced out of Alexandria by Ptolemy's advisors and was raising an army to reclaim her throne. She was around 21 years old at this point. Intelligent, educated and politically savvy. She spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, which was unusual for the Ptolemies, who usually only spoke Greek. She understood that Egypt needed Rome's support to remain independent, and she saw Caesar's arrival as an opportunity. Caesar announced that he was there to mediate the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra as a representative of Rome. This was partly true. He also wanted Egypt to pay the debts that Ptolemy's father had owed to Rome, which were substantial, and he probably wanted to rest his army and resupply after the difficult campaign against Pompey. Cleopatra needed to get to Caesar before Ptolemy's advisors could poison him against her. But she was outside the city, and Ptolemy controlled Alexandria. So she came up with a plan. She had herself smuggled into the palace, reportedly rolled up in a carpet or a linen sack, and delivered directly to Caesar's quarters. When the carpet was unrolled, there was Cleopatra. It was audacious, theatrical, and exactly the kind of bold move that would appeal to Caesar. They talked. What they discussed, we don't know. But by the next morning, Cleopatra had Caesar's support. This enraged Ptolemy's advisors. They accused Caesar of bias and corruption. There were riots in Alexandria. The situation deteriorated into what became known as the Alexandrian War. Caesar was essentially besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria by Ptolemy's forces and the Alexandrian mob. He had only a few thousand soldiers with him, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The fighting lasted for months. At one point, the Alexandrians tried to destroy Caesar's ships in the harbor. Caesar set fire to the Egyptian fleet to prevent its capture, and the fire spread to parts of the city, including allegedly the famous Library of Alexandria. How much of the library was actually destroyed is debated by historians. Some sources say vast amounts were lost. Others suggest the damage was minimal. Either way, it was a cultural catastrophe, and Caesar was at least partially responsible. Caesar held out in Alexandria, fighting street battles and naval skirmishes while waiting for reinforcements. Eventually, fresh legions arrived from Syria and Asia Minor. The most famous reinforcement came from Mithridates of Pergamum, who arrived with an army that included a significant Jewish contingent. Their arrival forced Ptolemy to split his forces. Final battle was fought near the Nile. Caesar's forces defeated Ptolemy's army decisively. Ptolemy himself drowned trying to flee across the river, weighed down by his golden armor. Very dramatic, very Egyptian, very final. With Ptolemy dead, Caesar installed Cleopatra as the ruler of Egypt, along with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12. They were married, as was Ptolemaic tradition, but Cleopatra was clearly the one in charge. Caesar stayed in Egypt for a few more months, and during this time, he and Cleopatra became lovers. Their relationship was probably part political alliance and part genuine attraction. Cleopatra needed Roman support to maintain her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth and resources, but there also seems to have been real affection. Cleopatra was intelligent and charismatic, and Caesar appreciated intelligence. They spent time together, reportedly taking a luxurious cruise up the Nile on Cleopatra's royal barge. In the summer of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. The implication was obvious. Cleopatra claimed that Caesar was the father. Caesar never officially acknowledged him, but he never denied it either. It was politically complicated. Caesar was married to a Roman woman back home, and acknowledging an Egyptian bastard son would have caused scandal. But Caesar had to leave Egypt. Pompey's remaining supporters were regrouping, and there were problems in Asia Minor that needed his attention. Pharnas's II, the king of Pontus, was taking advantage of the Roman civil war to expand his territory. Caesar marched east to deal with him. The campaign against Pharnaces was absurdly quick. Caesar met him in battle at Zela in August 47 BC. The battle lasted maybe 4 hours. Caesar's legions crushed Pharnas's army completely. It was such an easy, decisive victory that Caesar sent a report back to Rome with just 3 words: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. It's one of history's most famous phrases. 3 words that perfectly captured Caesar's genius for self-promotion and his ability to make even military victory sound effortless. The reality was that Caesar was exhausted. His army was stretched thin, and there were still Pompeian forces operating in Africa and Spain that needed to be defeated. But Veni, vidi, vici sounded better than I'm dealing with yet another messy cleanup campaign. Mopping up and returning to Rome, Caesar returned to Italy in September 47 BC. He'd been gone for nearly 2 years, fighting in Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Rome had been without his presence, and things had got messy. There were riots, political infighting, and dangerous levels of debt that were causing social unrest. One of Caesar's own officers, a man named Dolabella, had been proposing radical debt relief legislation that would essentially forgive all debts. This made the poor very happy and the wealthy absolutely terrified. Mark Antony, who Caesar had left in charge as master of horse, tried to suppress the unrest and ended up using troops against Roman citizens. There were deaths. It was a mess. Caesar also had a near mutiny on his hands. Some of his legions, particularly the veteran 10th Legion that had been with him since Gaul, were demanding their discharge and their promised rewards. They'd been fighting for years. They were tired. They wanted land, money, and retirement. Caesar addressed the mutinous soldiers in a famous speech. He called them citizens instead of soldiers, which was a subtle insult suggesting they were no longer part of his army. He told them they were discharged, they could go home, and they'd get their rewards after his triumph. The soldiers were shocked. They begged to be taken back, to continue serving under him. Caesar relented with conditions. It was brilliant psychology. He made them beg to stay with him rather than demanding to leave. But Caesar still had military problems. The remaining Pompeian forces had regrouped in North Africa under Cato the Younger and Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio. They had the support of King Juba of Numidia, who commanded a significant army. Caesar needed to eliminate them to truly end the civil war. In late 47 BC, Caesar landed in Africa with a relatively small force. The campaign started badly. Caesar was outnumbered, and the Pompeians had cavalry superiority thanks to Juba's Numidian horsemen. There were several inconclusive battles and skirmishes. Caesar was struggling, but Caesar's luck and skill held. At the Battle of Thapsus in April 46 BC, Caesar's legions decisively defeated the combined Pompeian and Numidian forces. Scipio's army was destroyed. Scipio himself committed suicide. Cato, who had withdrawn to Utica, also committed suicide rather than live in a world where Caesar was supreme. Cato's death was particularly theatrical. He read Plato's Phaedo about the immortality of the soul and Socrates' death, then stabbed himself. When his servants stitched the wound and saved him, he tore out his own intestines to finish the job. Cato's suicide made him a martyr for the Republican cause. He became a symbol of principled resistance to tyranny. People wrote pamphlets praising his virtue. It annoyed Caesar immensely. Caesar even wrote a pamphlet called Anti-Cato, arguing that Cato was actually a stubborn, self-righteous prick whose suicide was just attention-seeking, which was maybe not the best look for a man trying to present himself as merciful and above petty rivalries. But it shows that Cato had gotten under Caesar's skin even in death. With Africa secured, Caesar returned to Rome in the summer of 46 BC. He finally got to celebrate his triumphs. Not just one triumph, 4 of them, for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The celebrations lasted for days. There were parades, games, feasts, theatrical performances, mock naval battles, gladiatorial combats, and wild beast hunts. Caesar distributed gifts to the people. Every Roman citizen got money. The soldiers got bonuses and land. And in Caesar's Gallic triumph, paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, was Vercingetorix, the Gallic king who had united the tribes and nearly defeated Caesar 6 years earlier. He'd been kept in a Roman prison all this time, waiting for this moment. After the triumph, Vercingetorix was strangled in prison, which was the traditional fate for defeated enemy leaders. It was the standard practice, still brutal, still a reminder that Roman mercy had limits. The triumphs established Caesar as the undisputed master of Rome. He'd conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, subdued Egypt, crushed the remaining opposition. He had no rivals left except for Pompey's sons, who were still fighting in Spain with the remnants of the Pompeian faction. Caesar was appointed dictator again, this time for 10 years. This was unprecedented. The dictatorship was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure. 10 years was essentially permanent. Caesar also held multiple other offices and honors simultaneously. He was consul. He controlled the army. He was Pontifex Maximus. He had more concentrated power than anyone in Roman history. And he started acting like it. He began implementing reforms, some genuinely beneficial, some more self-serving. He reformed the calendar, creating what we now call the Julian calendar. The old Roman calendar was a mess, constantly falling out of sync with the seasons. Caesar consulted with Egyptian astronomers and created a solar calendar with 365 days, and a leap year every 4 years. It's basically the calendar we still use today, with minor modifications. He started massive public works projects. He planned to drain the Pomptine marshes, dig a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, build new public buildings in Rome. He granted citizenship to people in Cisalpine Gaul and settled veterans in colonies throughout the empire. He expanded the Senate, adding supporters and representatives from the provinces. Some of these reforms were genuinely good for Rome. Others were clearly about consolidating power and rewarding allies. But Caesar was getting things done, which was more than the squabbling Senate had managed in recent decades. However, his behavior was becoming increasingly autocratic. He allowed people to worship him with semi-divine honors. Statues of Caesar were erected throughout Rome. His image appeared on coins while he was still alive, which was traditionally only done for dead people. He wore elaborate clothing, including a purple toga and a laurel crown. He sat on a golden throne when receiving senators. This made people uncomfortable. Romans had spent 5 centuries hating kings. The whole foundation of the Republic was rejecting monarchy. And here was Caesar, looking and acting more like a king every day. He insisted he wasn't a king, but the distinction was getting blurry. In 45 BC, Caesar had to deal with one final military challenge. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised a rebellion in Spain with the support of surviving Pompeian loyalists. Caesar marched to Spain and fought the Battle of Munda in March 45 BC. Munda was the hardest fought battle of the entire civil war. The Pompeian forces fought desperately, knowing they had no hope of clemency after so many defeats. Caesar's legions were pushed to the breaking point. At one point, Caesar himself grabbed a shield and rushed into the front lines to rally his troops, which was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless for a man in his mid-50s. The battle was in doubt for hours. Eventually, Caesar's cavalry managed to get around the Pompeian flank, and the enemy lines collapsed. The Pompeians were slaughtered. Gnaeus Pompey was killed shortly after the battle. Sextus escaped and would continue to cause problems later. But for now, the organized resistance was over. Munda marked the end of the civil war. Caesar had defeated all his enemies. Rome was his, but the victory had cost him. The years of fighting had taken a toll. Caesar was suffering from health problems, possibly epilepsy, definitely from the stress and physical demands of constant campaigning. He was tired, and maybe he was getting careless. The Ides of March approach. Caesar returned to Rome in October 45 BC as the absolute master of the Roman world. The civil war was over. His enemies were dead or scattered. The Senate was filled with his appointees. He had been named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, not for a fixed term, not until the emergency ended, permanently. This was the final straw for many Romans. A temporary dictatorship was one thing. It had historical precedent, but a permanent dictatorship was monarchy in all but name. And Romans really hated kings. The last king of Rome had been expelled nearly 500 years earlier, and the Republic was founded on the principle that no no one man should have absolute power. But Caesar kept accumulating honors and breaking traditions. The Senate voted him the right to wear triumphal garb permanently. His statues were placed in temples alongside the gods. The month of Quintilis was renamed July in his honor. He was planning a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire to avenge Crassus's defeat at Carrhae. He was essentially unstoppable. And yet, Caesar was also showing restraint in some ways. He pardoned many of his former enemies. He appointed former Pompeians to important positions, including Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, two men who had fought against him. This was part of his policy of clementia, but it was also political calculation. By showing mercy and incorporating former enemies into his government, he hoped to heal the wounds of civil war and legitimize his rule. It didn't work, because underneath the pardons and the positions, many of these men still hated Caesar. They saw him as a tyrant who had destroyed the Republic. They viewed his clemency not as mercy, but as condescension. Being pardoned by Caesar meant admitting that he had the power to pardon them, which reinforced his superiority. Brutus was particularly conflicted. He was Caesar's friend, possibly even his illegitimate son, according to rumors, because Caesar had an affair with Brutus's mother Servilia that lasted for years. But Brutus also came from a family that claimed descent from Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Republic, who had expelled the last king. The burden of family legacy weighed heavily on him. Cassius was more straightforward in his hatred. He'd fought for Pompey, been pardoned by Caesar, given positions and honors, and he still despised everything Caesar represented. He was ambitious, resentful, and convinced that Caesar was a tyrant who needed to be removed. A conspiracy began forming in late 45 or early 44 BC. The exact details are murky because the conspirators tried to keep it secret, and our sources were written after the fact. But eventually, about 60 senators and equestrians were involved in varying degrees. Some were core conspirators who actively planned the assassination. Others were sympathizers who knew about it and didn't object. The ringleaders were Cassius and Brutus, though Cassius was probably the driving force. The conspirators called themselves the Liberators. They saw themselves as defenders of the Republic, patriots removing a tyrant. They genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, that once Caesar was dead, the Republic would magically restore itself, and everything would go back to how it was before the Civil War. This was delusional. The Republic had been dying for decades. The Civil War was a symptom of systemic problems, not the cause. Caesar was a product of the Republic's dysfunction, not the source of it. Killing him wouldn't fix anything. But the conspirators couldn't see this. Or maybe they didn't want to see it. They set the date for March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March. There was a Senate meeting scheduled for that day at the Theater of Pompey, because the Senate House was still being rebuilt after the fire during Clodius's funeral years earlier. The theater was outside the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome, which meant Caesar could attend while still holding his military command. It was the perfect opportunity The Senate would be gathered, Caesar would be there, and the conspirators could strike. In the days leading up to the Ides, there were omens, or at least, people later claimed there were omens. Soothsayers warned Caesar. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares about his death and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. A seer supposedly told him to beware the Ides of March. Whether these omens actually happened or were invented afterward to make the story more dramatic, we don't know. Romans loved omens in their historical narratives. On the morning of March 15, Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate. Calpurnia was upset. The omens were supposedly bad, and Caesar wasn't feeling well. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and one of Caesar's trusted friends, came to the house and convinced him to attend. He told Caesar that the Senate was waiting to offer him new honors, maybe even the title of king for his eastern provinces. Caesar shouldn't offend them by not showing up. Caesar agreed and left for the theater of Pompey. This is one of the cruelest ironies of the assassination. Caesar was convinced to go to his death by someone he trusted, someone he considered a friend, who was actively plotting to kill him. Caesar arrived at the theater of Pompey. The Senate was in session. As he entered, someone handed him a note warning him of the conspiracy. Caesar took it, but didn't read it. He was surrounded by people, senators pressing forward, petitioners asking for favors. The crowd was thick. The conspirators had planned their approach. They would surround Caesar under the guise of petitioning him, then strike simultaneously so that no single person could be blamed and everyone would share the responsibility. It was mob murder by committee. A senator named Julius Caesar approached Caesar with a petition. As Caesar read it, Caesar grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. The conspirators closed in. Casca struck the first blow, stabbing at Caesar's neck. But he was nervous or incompetent, and the wound wasn't fatal. Caesar grabbed Casca's arm and stabbed him with his stylus, the pen he'd been using. Then the others attacked. Caesar fought back at first. He was in his mid-50s, not a young man, but still strong and skilled. He tried to defend himself, tried to fight his way out. But there were too many attackers coming from all sides, swords and daggers stabbing and slashing. 23 wounds in total by some accounts. At some point during the attack, Caesar saw Brutus among the conspirators. And according to the historian Suetonius, Caesar said "Kai su teknon," which is Greek for "you too, child." Shakespeare later translated this into the famous Latin phrase "et tu, brute," which isn't historically accurate, but sounds better. Whether Caesar actually said this, we don't know. Ancient sources disagree, but the sentiment captures the betrayal. Caesar had trusted Brutus, maybe even loved him, and Brutus was among those killing him. Caesar stopped fighting. Some sources say he pulled his toga over his head so he wouldn't see his murderers. Others say he just collapsed. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding from 23 wounds, surrounded by the men who had claimed to be saving the Republic by killing him. Gaius Julius Caesar was dead. The man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rhine and the Channel, won the civil war, reformed the calendar, and made himself dictator for life, was lying in a pool of his own blood on the floor of the Senate. The conspirators stood there with bloody daggers, expecting what? Applause, celebration, the people rushing forward to thank them for liberating Rome. Instead, there was silence, then panic. The other senators fled. The people in the streets were shocked and confused. Some of the conspirators ran through Rome shouting about liberty and the death of tyranny. The crowds didn't cheer. They went home and locked their doors. Because whatever the conspirators thought would happen, this was the beginning of another crisis, not the end of one. The aftermath of blood, so there was Caesar's body, lying on the floor of the theater of Pompey, 23 stab wounds bleeding out onto the marble. The conspirators had done it. They'd killed the dictator. They'd struck a blow for liberty and the Republic. And now they were standing there with bloody daggers, waiting for Rome to thank them. It didn't happen. The other senators had fled the moment the stabbing started. The theater of Pompey was essentially empty except for the conspirators and Caesar's corpse. Outside, word was spreading through the city. Caesar had been murdered. The dictator was dead. People didn't know what to do. Some were afraid. Some were angry. Almost nobody was celebrating. Conspirators had made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that Rome hated Caesar as much as they did, that the people would welcome his death and immediately restore the Republic to its former glory. But most Romans actually liked Caesar. He'd given them land, money, entertainment, and victories. He'd been generous and charismatic and successful. The Senate aristocrats might have hated him, but the common people, they'd lost a patron and protector. The conspirators tried to rally support. They marched to the Capitol Hill with their bloody daggers, shouting about liberty and tyranny. Brutus tried to give a speech explaining their actions. Some people listened. Most were confused or scared. The city was tense, uncertain, potentially violent. Nobody knew if this was the beginning of another civil war or what would happen next. Caesar's body was left lying in the theater for hours. Eventually, 3 of his slaves came with a litter and carried him home. One of his arms was hanging off the side of the litter, swaying as they walked through the streets. It was undignified and pathetic, this great conqueror being carried home by servants after being stabbed to death by his supposed friends. Mark Antony, who had been consul alongside Caesar, went into hiding. He was afraid the conspirators might come for him next. But the conspirators hadn't actually planned beyond the assassination itself. They had no list of additional targets, no comprehensive plan for what to do after Caesar was dead. They just assumed everything would work out once the tyrant was removed. This is the kind of thinking that makes historians want to scream into their pillows. You can't just murder the most powerful man in Rome and expect things to magically fix themselves. The Roman world didn't run on ideals and principles. It ran on power, patronage, and military force. And the conspirators had just created a massive power vacuum without any plan to fill it. The next day, March 16, there was a meeting of the Senate. Both the conspirators and Caesar's supporters attended, though everyone was armed and tense. Mark Antony, who had emerged from hiding, proposed a compromise. The conspirators would not be prosecuted for Caesar's murder. In exchange, all of Caesar's acts and appointments would remain valid. This was politically brilliant. It meant the conspirators wouldn't be punished, but Caesar's reforms and the positions he'd granted would stand. It prevented immediate civil war while preserving Caesar's political legacy. The Senate agreed. It seemed like Rome might avoid another bloodbath. There was even talk of reconciliation. Brutus and Cassius were invited to dinner at Antony's house. Lepidus, Caesar's master of horse, had dinner with Brutus. Maybe peace was possible. Then came Caesar's funeral. Mark Antony delivered the eulogy, and he was brilliant. He read Caesar's will, which left 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen, and donated his gardens across the Tiber to the public. The crowd loved this. Caesar had remembered them even in death. Then Antony showed them Caesar's bloody toga, pointing out each stab wound, describing how the conspirators had surrounded and murdered him. He didn't have to explicitly condemn the assassins. The crowd's rage did that for him. The people rioted. They were furious. They tried to hunt down Brutus and Cassius and the other conspirators. They grabbed firebrands from Caesar's funeral pyre and tried to burn down the houses of the assassins. They killed a poet named Helvius Cinna because they confused him with one of the conspirators who had the same last name. Just grabbed him off the street and tore him apart because his name was Cinna, and they were angry. Brutus and Cassius had to flee Rome. So much for being celebrated as liberators. Within days of the assassination, the men who killed Caesar were exiled from the city, hated by the mob, and running for their lives. Their grand plan to restore the Republic had resulted in chaos, violence, and their own exile. But the real problem wasn't Brutus or Cassius. It was what came next, because Caesar was dead, but his legacy wasn't. And there were people ready to claim that legacy for themselves. Enter Octavian Caesar's, named his great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his primary heir. Octavius was 18 years old, the grandson of Caesar's sister Julia. Caesar had taken an interest in him, brought him on some campaigns, and apparently saw something promising in the young man. The will not only made Octavius his heir, but also adopted him posthumously. From that moment on, Gaius Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or as history would eventually know him, Augustus. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In March 44 BC, he was just Octavian, a teenager who had just inherited the name and fortune of the most famous man in Rome. He was in Apollonia, in modern-day Albania, studying and training with the legions that were supposed to accompany Caesar on his Parthian campaign. When news of the assassination reached him, Octavian had to make a decision. His family advised him to refuse the inheritance. It was too dangerous. Caesar's enemies would come for his heir. The political situation was unstable. He should stay away from Rome and let the adults handle things. Octavian ignored this advice. He accepted the inheritance, took Caesar's name, and returned to Italy. This teenager, barely old enough to shave, was now claiming to be Caesar's son and heir. Most people didn't take him seriously. Mark Antony certainly didn't. Antony was consul, commander of legions, an experienced politician and general. He'd been Caesar's right-hand man for years. He assumed he would be Caesar's political successor. The idea that some 18-year-old kid could challenge him was laughable. Antony refused to hand over Caesar's funds to Octavian. He dismissed him in meetings. He called him boy in public. Big mistake. Octavian might have been young, but he was ruthless, patient, and extremely intelligent. And he had Caesar's name, which carried enormous weight with Caesar's veterans and supporters. Octavian started cultivating the loyalty of Caesar's old soldiers. He paid them bonuses from his own money and borrowed funds. He reminded them that he was Caesar's son and heir. He positioned himself as the rightful successor to Caesar's legacy, and the soldiers responded. They'd loved Caesar, and here was Caesar's son offering them money and loyalty. Meanwhile, the political situation was deteriorating. Mark Antony was trying to consolidate power. He'd gotten himself assigned to the province of Cisalpine Gaul, which would give him command of legions and a power base in northern Italy. But the current governor of Cisalpine Gaul was Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators who had helped convince Caesar to go to the Senate on the Ides of March. Decimus Brutus refused to give up the province. Antony marched north with his legions to take it by force. Decimus Brutus fortified himself in the city of Mutina and prepared for a siege. This was late 44 BC, and Rome was sliding toward another civil war less than a year after Caesar's assassination. The Senate, seeing Antony as a threat, turned to Octavian. Yes, the same Senate that was full of conspirators and people who had opposed Caesar. They now asked Caesar's heir to use his legions against Antony. Octavian agreed, not because he supported the Senate, but because it gave him legitimacy and military command. The resulting conflict is called the Mutina War. Octavian and the consuls besieged Antony, who was besieging Decimus Brutus. It was siegeception. The battles were inconclusive, but Antony's position became untenable. He retreated from Mutina and headed west toward Gaul, where other commanders might support him. Octavian had won, technically, but both consuls died during the campaign, leaving Octavian in command of their legions. The Senate suddenly realized they'd given an enormous amount of military power to a teenager they couldn't control. They tried to sideline him, offering honors, but not real authority. Octavian responded by marching on Rome with his legions. In August 43 BC, he entered the city with his army and demanded the consulship. He was 19 years old. The legal age for consulship was 42. Nobody cared about legality anymore. Octavian had the army, so Octavian got what he wanted. He was elected consul alongside a relative nobody named Quintus Pedius. And then Octavian did something unexpected. He made peace with Mark Antony. The second triumvirate Antony had retreated to Gaul, where he'd convinced several commanders to join him, including Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who controlled legions in Spain and southern Gaul. Antony now had a significant military force again. He and Octavian could fight each other, continuing the cycle of civil war, or they could work together. They chose to work together. In November 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met on a small island in a river near Bononia. They negotiated for 3 days, hammering out an agreement. They would form a triumvirate, a 3-man dictatorship with legal authority to govern Rome. Unlike Caesar's informal first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus, this one would be official. The triumvirate for organizing the Republic, they called it. The organizing was a nice way of saying controlling through military force. The agreement divided up the Roman world. Antony got Gaul. Lepidus got Spain and southern Gaul. Octavian got Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia. They would share power, support each other, and eliminate their enemies. And eliminate their enemies they did. The second triumvirate instituted proscriptions, just like Sulla had done decades earlier. They published lists of names. Anyone on the list was declared an enemy of the state. They could be killed with impunity, and their property would be confiscated. It was legalized murder for political and financial gain. The proscriptions were horrific. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people were killed. The triumvirs put their own relatives on the lists if it was politically convenient. Antony had Cicero proscribed. Cicero, the greatest orator of his generation, who had spent his entire career defending the Republic, was hunted down and killed. His head and hands were cut off and displayed in the Forum. Antony's wife, Fulvia, reportedly stabbed Cicero's tongue with her hairpin as revenge for all the speeches he'd given against Antony. The proscriptions were about more than just revenge. They were also about funding. The triumvirs needed money to pay their soldiers and finance their campaigns. Confiscating the property of the proscribed gave them a massive influx of wealth. It was state-sponsored robbery with a veneer of legality. But the main target of the triumvirs wasn't random senators or wealthy equestrians. It was Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspirators who had killed Caesar. They'd fled to the eastern provinces after Caesar's assassination and had spent the past year and a half raising armies. They controlled Greece, Macedonia, and parts of Asia Minor. They had about 19 legions between them. They were the last major threat to the triumvirate's power. In 42 BC, Octavian and Antony led their armies east to confront Brutus and Cassius. They left Lepidus behind to govern Italy, which was basically sidelining him from the real action. Lepidus was the weakest of the 3 triumvirs, and it was already becoming clear that he was going to be pushed out eventually. The 2 sides met at Philippi in Macedonia in October 42 BC. There were actually 2 battles of Philippi, fought about 3 weeks apart. The first battle was confusing and inconclusive. Brutus's forces defeated Octavian's legions and overran his camp. Octavian himself allegedly hid in a marsh to escape being captured or killed. Not his finest moment, but on the other wing, Antony's forces defeated Cassius's legions. Cassius thought the entire battle was lost and committed suicide, which was premature since Brutus had actually won his portion of the battle. But Cassius was dead, and his army's morale was shattered. 3 weeks later, the second battle of Philippi was fought. Brutus was forced to give battle because his supply situation was deteriorating. Antony's forces crushed Brutus's legions. Brutus fled the battlefield and committed suicide, just like Cassius. The last of Caesar's assassins were dead. Well, not quite the last. Many of the conspirators had been killed in the proscriptions or at Philippi, but some escaped. Sextus Pompey, Pompey the Great's surviving son, was operating as a pirate in the Mediterranean with a powerful fleet. Decimus Brutus had been hunted down and killed trying to reach Macedonia. But there were a few conspirators who managed to survive and flee to obscurity. History mostly forgot about them. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the triumvirs had eliminated their main enemies. Now, they just had to figure out how to divide the Roman world between them without killing each other. Spoiler alert, this didn't go well. The triumvirate cracks after Philippi. The triumvirs redistributed territories. Antony got the rich eastern provinces. He was supposed to raise money from them and prepare for a campaign against Parthia to finally avenge Crassus's defeat. Octavian got the west, including Italy, which sounds good until you realize that Octavian was responsible for settling the veterans of the Civil War by giving them land. This meant confiscating property from Italian landowners and redistributing it to soldiers, which made him extremely unpopular. Lepidus got Africa. Again, he was increasingly marginalized, and everyone knew it. Octavian's task of settling veterans was a nightmare. He had to take land from people who'd done nothing wrong and give it to soldiers. The dispossessed landowners were understandably angry. There were protests, unrest, and even some armed resistance. Octavian was hated in Italy. His own soldiers were the only thing keeping him in power. Meanwhile, Antony was in the east, and he met Cleopatra. Remember her? Queen of Egypt, Caesar's former lover, mother of Caesarion. She'd stayed out of the civil wars mostly, maintaining Egypt's independence and wealth. But she needed Rome's support, and Antony needed Egypt's resources for his Parthian campaign. They met in Tarsus in 41 BC. Cleopatra arrived on a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Venus, surrounded by luxury and spectacle. It was theater designed to impress Antony, and it worked. They became lovers and political allies. Antony spent the winter of 41-40 BC in Alexandria with Cleopatra, which scandalized Roman opinion. A Roman general spending months in luxury with a foreign queen while neglecting his duties. It played into stereotypes about Eastern decadence, corrupting virtuous Romans. Back in Italy, things were falling apart for Octavian. Antony's wife, Fulvia, and his brother Lucius Antonius started a war against Octavian, claiming they were defending the rights of Italian landowners against Octavian's confiscations. This conflict is called the Perusian War, and it was messy. Octavian besieged Lucius Antonius in the city of Perusia and starved him into surrender. Fulvia fled to Greece. When Antony heard about this, he was furious. His wife and brother had been fighting Octavian, and the triumvirate was on the verge of collapse. Antony sailed back from Egypt with his fleet, ready for war. But both sides pulled back from the brink. They met at Brundisium in 40 BC and negotiated yet another agreement. To seal the peace, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. This was possible because Fulvia had conveniently died of illness, leaving Antony a widower. Poor Octavia. She was by all accounts a decent, intelligent woman who got used as a political pawn. She married Antony and tried to maintain peace between him and her brother. It was a thankless role. For a few years, the triumvirate held together. Antony was in the east, preparing his Parthian campaign. Octavian was in Italy, consolidating power and dealing with Sextus Pompey, who was still causing problems with his pirate fleet. They defeated Sextus in a series of naval battles, finally eliminating him in 35 BC. Lepidus tried to assert himself during the campaign against Sextus, demanding Sicily as his territory. Octavian responded by simply appealing directly to Lepidus's legions, asking them who they'd rather follow, Lepidus or Caesar's heir. The soldiers chose Octavian. Lepidus was forced to retire. He lived out the rest of his life in comfortable but powerless obscurity. The triumvirate was now just two people, Octavian and Antony. Antony, Cleopatra, and the final war, Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BC, was a disaster. He invaded Parthia with a massive army, something like 100,000 men, including allied forces. The campaign was poorly planned and undersupplied. The Parthians used their classic tactics, harassing the Roman army with mounted archers, avoiding pitched battles, and destroying supply lines. Antony lost tens of thousands of men and had to retreat. It was humiliating. After this failure, Antony spent more and more time in the east with Cleopatra. They had 3 children together, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony started adopting Eastern customs and honors. He declared that Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was Caesar's legitimate heir, which directly challenged Octavian's position. In 34 BC, Antony held a ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. He distributed various eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children. It was a very un-Roman thing to do. Romans didn't create kings and queens. Romans conquered territories and made them provinces. Antony was acting like a Hellenistic monarch, not a Roman general. Octavian used this brilliantly for propaganda. He portrayed Antony as corrupted by Eastern decadence, bewitched by a foreign queen, betraying Roman values and interests. He claimed Antony planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria, that Antony was giving away Roman territories to his Egyptian mistress and her children. Whether any of this was true didn't really matter. It made for great propaganda. The tension built for years. Both sides knew war was coming. It was just a matter of when and how. In 32 BC, Octavian obtained Antony's will, possibly through bribery or theft, and read it to the Senate. The will confirmed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, that he recognized Caesarion as Caesar's son, and that he'd made various provisions for his children with Cleopatra. The Senate was outraged. Octavian Octavian convinced the Senate to declare war, not against Antony directly, because Antony was still technically a Roman citizen and magistrate, but against Cleopatra. Egypt was declared an enemy of Rome. Antony, by siding with Cleopatra, became a traitor by association. The final war of the Roman Republic began in 31 BC. Both sides assembled massive forces. Antony and Cleopatra had about 500 ships and perhaps 75,000 infantry. Octavian had a slightly smaller fleet, but better trained crews under his Admiral Marcus Agrippa, who was a brilliant naval commander. The decisive battle was fought at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, in September 31 BC. It was primarily a naval engagement. The details are disputed by ancient sources, but the outcome was clear. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's command, defeated Antony's forces. During the battle, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly sailed away from the fight, heading back to Egypt. Antony, seeing this, abandoned his own fleet and followed her in a fast ship. Whether this was a planned retreat or a panicked flight is debated. Either way, it was a disaster. Antony's remaining forces, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered to Octavian over the following days. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria. They spent the winter preparing for a siege, but they knew it was hopeless. Octavian pursued them with his army. In August 30 BC, Octavian's forces entered Alexandria. Antony's remaining supporters deserted him. Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had committed suicide. Devastated, he stabbed himself. But Cleopatra wasn't actually dead. When she heard that Antony had wounded himself, she had him brought to her. He died in her arms, which is tragic and romantic, and probably wouldn't have consoled Antony much since he was bleeding to death. Cleopatra tried to negotiate with Octavian. She wanted guarantees for her children, for Egypt's independence, for her own safety. Octavian was polite but non-committal. He wanted Cleopatra alive to parade in his triumph back in Rome. Cleopatra realized this and decided she'd rather die than be displayed as a captive. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra committed suicide. The famous story is that she used an asp, a poisonous snake, smuggled into her chambers in a basket of figs. Modern historians are skeptical. Poison would have been more reliable. But the snake story is dramatic and fits with Cleopatra's flair for theatrical gestures, so it persists. With Cleopatra dead, Egypt fell under Roman control. Octavian had Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, hunted down and killed. The boy was about 17. Octavian couldn't afford to have another potential son of Caesar running around. Antony and Cleopatra's younger children were spared and sent to Rome to be raised by Octavia, Antony's widow, which was awkward but pragmatic. The civil wars were over. Finally, decades of conflict, from Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC to the fall of Alexandria in 30 BC. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. And now, there was one man standing at the top of the Roman world, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's heir, the last man standing, Caesar's ghost, and the questions, so let's circle back to the original question. Was Julius Caesar a hero or a tyrant? Or both? The honest answer is that he was complicated, like most historical figures who aren't simplified into cartoon villains or saints. Caesar was brilliant, charismatic, ruthless, generous, vain, strategic, and absolutely determined to be the most important person in any room he entered. He was a hero in the sense that he was extraordinarily talented. His military genius is undeniable. The conquest of Gaul, the campaigns in the Civil War, his ability to inspire fanatical loyalty from his soldiers. These were real achievements. He was also a reformer who implemented genuinely beneficial changes. The Julian calendar, land redistribution, extension of citizenship, public works. These things helped people. But he was also responsible for the deaths of perhaps 1 million people in Gaul. The conquest was brutal, often genocidal. He sold entire tribes into slavery. He destroyed cultures and peoples who had the misfortune to be in his way. And he did it primarily for personal glory and political advancement, not for any noble principle. He was a tyrant in the sense that he overthrew the republic and concentrated power in himself. Yes, the republic was dysfunctional and probably dying anyway. Yes, the Senate was corrupt and ineffective. But Caesar's solution was to make himself dictator for life, to place himself above the law and the traditional structures of Roman governance. That's tyranny, regardless of how benevolent or effective he might have been. The conspirators who killed him believed they were defending the Republic. They saw Caesar as a king in all but name, and they thought removing him would restore freedom and republican government. They were wrong. The Republic was already dead. Killing Caesar just created another power vacuum that led to more civil wars. And ultimately, what emerged wasn't the Republic restored, but the empire under Augustus. Caesar's legacy is empire, not just the territorial expansion, though that was significant, but the transformation of Rome from a republic into an autocracy ruled by one man with absolute power. Augustus would formalize this, creating the system of the Principate. But it was Caesar who broke the Republic beyond repair. The emperors who followed, from Augustus to Nero to Marcus Aurelius to the fall of Rome centuries later, were all building on the foundation Caesar created. Was he a hero? To his soldiers, to the people who benefited from his reforms, to those who saw him as a champion against a corrupt aristocracy? Yes. Was he a tyrant? To the Gauls he conquered, to the senators whose power he usurped, to anyone who valued the Republic's traditions and laws? Absolutely. The truth is he was both. He was a man of extraordinary ability who used that ability to accumulate power, and in doing so, he changed the course of Western history. Whether that change was for better or worse depends on your perspective and what you value. What we can say definitively is that Julius Caesar was one of the most consequential figures in human history. His name became a title: Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar. For 2,000 years, rulers have claimed his legacy. His life and death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. And on March 15, 44 BC, he died on the floor of the Senate, surrounded by men who claimed to love the Republic more than they feared the consequences of murder. His blood soaked into Roman marble, and the Republic died with him, even though it would take another 14 years and another civil war before everyone accepted that fact. The long shadow after Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. He returned to Rome in 29 BC. He'd been fighting, directly or through proxies, for nearly 15 years. He was 33 years old and controlled the entire Roman world. Every legion answered to him. The Senate was packed with his supporters. There was no one left to challenge him. But Octavian was smarter than his great uncle. He'd seen what happened to Julius Caesar when he became too openly autocratic. The dictatorship for life, the divine honors, the purple toga, and golden throne. All of that had made Caesar look like a king, and Romans hated kings enough to stab them 23 times on the Senate floor. So Octavian didn't make himself dictator. Instead, in 27 BC, he made a great show of restoring the Republic. He announced he was giving back all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate, grateful and terrified, immediately gave him a pile of new powers and the title Augustus, which means the revered one. It was a religious title, not a political one. Very clever. Octavian became Augustus, and he spent the next 40 years creating the Roman Empire, while insisting he was just the first citizen, the princeps, in a restored republic. It was all fiction, but it was politically brilliant fiction. Augustus had absolute power, but he dressed it up in republican language and traditional offices. He held consulships, tribunician power, imperium. All legal, all traditional, just concentrated in one person permanently. The forms of the Republic were preserved even as the reality was dictatorship. And it worked. Augustus ruled for 41 years until his death in AD 14. He brought peace after generations of civil war. He reformed administration, built infrastructure, patronized the arts. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, began under Augustus. People were so exhausted from civil wars that they accepted autocracy in exchange for stability. But none of this would have been possible without Julius Caesar. Caesar broke the Republic's structures. He proved that a charismatic general with loyal legions could overthrow the government and seize power. He showed that the Senate couldn't stop someone who was willing to cross the Rubicon. And his death proved that assassination wouldn't restore the Republic. It would just create another civil war. Augustus learned from all of this. He was more careful, more patient, more willing to maintain the illusion of republicanism. But he was walking a path Caesar had cleared. The emperors who followed Augustus had varying levels of success. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. Some were competent. Some were insane. All were autocrats who held power that would have been unthinkable in the old republic. And all of them, in some way, were heirs to Julius Caesar's revolution. Even the conspirators, in a twisted way, proved Caesar's point. They thought they were defending the Republic, but what they actually did was demonstrate that the Republic couldn't function anymore. It couldn't handle the personal ambitions, the client armies, the massive wealth flowing in from the provinces. the system was broken, and killing Caesar didn't fix it. It just made the next phase of the collapse more violent. Caesar's writings survived too. His commentaries on the Gallic War and his commentary on the Civil War became foundational texts. For centuries, students learning Latin read Caesar's clear, elegant prose. Generals studied his tactics. Politicians studied his propaganda techniques. Veni, vidi, vici, and the die is cast became immortal phrases. Even people who have never studied Roman history know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon and that the Ides of March are ominous. Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, written 1600 years after his death, shaped how English-speaking people think about him. Et tu, brute, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. These aren't historical quotes, they're Shakespeare, but they've become part of how we understand Caesar's story. The noble Brutus torn between friendship and duty. The ambitious Caesar reaching for a crown. Mark Antony's manipulation of the Roman mob. These characterizations, whether accurate or not, have endured. And what about Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who nearly defeated Caesar? He became a symbol of resistance against oppression. In the 19th century, French nationalists claimed him as a hero fighting against Roman imperialism. There are statues of Vercingetorix in France. He's remembered as a freedom fighter, even though he lost and was strangled in a Roman prison. Caesar's conquest of Gaul brought Latin language and Roman culture to Western Europe, which shaped the development of French, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian. So, in a very real sense, Caesar's actions 2,000 years ago still echo in the languages people speak today. The question of whether Caesar was a hero or a tyrant has been debated for 2 millennia. Renaissance humanists admired him as an exemplar of virtue and ability. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether his overthrow of the Republic was justified. Revolutionaries in various eras have both condemned him as a tyrant and celebrated him as a populist champion. Modern historians argue about his motives, his morality, and his impact. The answer probably depends on who you ask and what you value. If you value stability, order, and effective government, Caesar's destruction of the dysfunctional republic and the eventual establishment of the empire might seem like progress. If you value liberty, republicanism, and limitations on power, Caesar's dictatorship is tyranny regardless of how competent or merciful he might have been. If you're one of the Gauls whose tribe was destroyed, whose family was enslaved, whose culture was eradicated, Caesar was absolutely a villain. If you're a Roman citizen who received land and money from Caesar's distributions, or a soldier who became wealthy from Gallic plunder, he was a hero and a patron. History isn't simple. People aren't simple. Julius Caesar was a man of extraordinary talent who used that talent in pursuit of power and glory. He achieved both, and the cost was measured in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the destruction of a 500-year-old republic. He was assassinated by men who thought they were saving Rome, but his legacy outlived them all. 23 stab wounds, 23 conspirators, and 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him, still debating what he meant, and whether he was right or wrong, still using his name as a synonym for absolute power. That's the thing about legacy. You don't get to control it. Caesar wanted glory, and he got it. But he also got centuries of debate, criticism, reinterpretation, and argument. He became a symbol that means different things to different people, a warning about ambition, an example of genius, a case study in the corruption of power, a reminder that republics are fragile and can be destroyed by determined individuals. His great-nephew Octavian, who became Augustus, probably understood Caesar better than anyone. He took Caesar's methods, but softened the presentation. He achieved Caesar's goals of sole rule, but wrapped it in republican language. He learned from Caesar's mistakes, particularly the mistake of being too obviously autocratic. And in doing so, he created a system that lasted for centuries. But it all started with a man who crossed a small river with one legion and started a civil war because he refused to face prosecution. A man who conquered Gaul and killed, or enslaved 1 million people for personal glory. A man who showed clemency to his defeated enemies and was stabbed to death by those same enemies. A man who reformed the calendar and whose name became a title for emperors. A man who was brilliant, ambitious, ruthless, charismatic, and ultimately very, very human. So, hero or tyrant? Both. Neither. Something more complicated than either label can capture. Julius Caesar was Julius Caesar, unique and impossible to reduce to simple categories. And maybe that's the most honest answer we can give. The die was cast. The Rubicon was crossed. The Republic fell. The Empire rose. And 2,000 years later, we're still trying to figure out whether any of it was inevitable, whether one man could have made different choices, whether the end of the Republic was tragedy or necessity, or both. But for now, as we drift toward sleep with these thoughts, we can at least acknowledge that history is complicated. People are complicated, and sometimes the most important figures in human history are the ones who defy simple moral categorization. Julius Caesar changed the world. Whether that change was for better or worse, we're still living with the consequences and still arguing about the answer. And on that note, with the ghost of Caesar lingering somewhere between hero and tyrant, perhaps it's time to close our eyes and let the weight of 2,000 years of history gently pull us toward sleep. The conspirators are dead. The empire has fallen. But the questions remain, echoing quietly through the centuries, as relevant now as they were on the Ides of March in 44 BC. Sleep well.